Brace for impact. Ramming speed. Attack! For the Pharaoh! Charge for our glory! Victory is ours!
Hey buddy, welcome back. Go ahead and get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether you're lying in bed with your eyes already closing or sitting on the couch with the room quiet around you, just let your shoulders drop for a moment. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. Tonight we're going somewhere very old and very far away, and I want you to arrive there slowly. So let's begin with something small. Imagine standing at the edge of a river just before sunrise. The air is cool, almost damp, which feels strange, because you know that by midday this same air will be hot enough to shimmer over the sand. Somewhere behind you, a rooster hasn't been invented yet, but you can hear geese, and the low murmur of people already awake, already moving toward the water with clay jars balanced against their hips. The river is the color of hammered metal in this light, not yet blue, not yet gold. And on its surface, so faint you could almost miss it, there's a thin green line of scum and silt, left behind from the flood that came through weeks ago. That line is the reason any of this exists at all. That line is the reason a civilization was able to survive in the middle of one of the driest places on Earth for 3,000 years. Here's something people rarely stop to consider. Ancient Egypt, as we tend to picture it, lasted longer than the gap between us and ancient Egypt itself. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than she did to the builders of the Great Pyramid. Think about that for a moment. When Cleopatra looked up at the pyramids of Giza, she was looking at something already more than 2,000 years old. To her, they were ancient history too. That's the kind of thing this journey is built around. Not just pharaohs and gold masks and the things you've probably already seen in documentaries and museum halls. Tonight, we're going to walk through the ordinary mornings. We're going to step into mudbrick homes where bread was baking before the sun came up, stand beside farmers reading the height of the floodwater like a fortune, and sit quietly beside scribes hunched over reed pens in rooms that smelled of ink and dust. We're going to watch pyramids rise not as monuments, but as decades-long projects run by real people with families waiting for them at home. We're going to meet gods who were feared and gods who were loved, sometimes the same god depending on the day. And we're going to follow this civilization all the way from its first quiet beginnings along the Nile to its final, almost lonely closing chapter, when the last pharaoh Egypt would ever have took her own life rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome. If you enjoy these kinds of quiet journeys into the past, you're welcome to subscribe and join us for the next one. No pressure at all. Just an open door if you'd like to come back. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's late evening on the East Coast, or maybe the sun hasn't even set yet where you are on the West Coast. Maybe you're somewhere in Europe already deep into the night, or somewhere in Asia just waking up to a new morning. Wherever you are, drop a comment and tell me your city and your local time. I always find it a little remarkable, all of us scattered across so many time zones, quietly sharing the same old story about a river valley in Northeast Africa. And if you have any particular fascination with ancient Egypt already, whether it's the pyramids, the pharaohs, the mummies, or simply the mystery of how any of this survived for so long, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments as we go. Now, let's slow down and let's begin at the very beginning. Not with kings. Not yet. Let's begin with mud and water, and the first people who ever looked at this river and decided to stay. The gift of the river, there's an old observation, often credited to the Greek historian Herodotus, that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. He wrote that sometime around 450 BCE, visiting Egypt as a curious traveler from a world that was already fascinated by how old this civilization seemed even then. And it's a simple phrase, but it holds up remarkably well, because almost nothing about Egyptian life makes sense without first understanding this one river. Picture the geography for a moment, because it matters more than it might seem. Egypt sits inside one of the most unforgiving deserts on the planet. To the west, the Sahara stretches on for thousands of miles, empty and dry. To the east, more desert, broken only by rocky hills that eventually fall away to the Red Sea. And running directly through the middle of all this, like a green thread pulled taut across a bed of sand, is the Nile. The river flows north, which surprises a lot of people the first time they hear it, because we're used to thinking of maps with north being simply up, and rivers flowing down toward the bottom. But the Nile begins far to the south, fed by highlands and lakes deep in central and eastern Africa, and it travels north for thousands of miles before finally spreading out into a wide, marshy delta and emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient Egyptians actually organized their whole sense of geography around this. Upper Egypt was the south, where the land was higher in elevation even though it sat lower on a map. Lower Egypt was the north, where the river fanned out into the delta. And once a year, with a rhythm so reliable that people could set their entire calendar around it, the Nile flooded. This flood, called the inundation, came from heavy seasonal rains and melting snow far to the south, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia. The water would rise in Egypt sometime around June, cresting through the late summer months, and then slowly recede by autumn. When it pulled back, it left behind a fresh layer of black, nutrient-rich silt across the fields. This is actually where the ancient name for Egypt itself may come from. They called their land Kemet, which is often translated as the Black Land, referring to this rich, dark soil. Everything beyond the reach of the flood, the harsh desert stretching out on either side, they called Deseret, the Red Land. It's a strange thing to sit with, how much of a civilization's entire identity can be built around the color of dirt. But when you understand how the Black Land and the Red Land worked, you start to understand everything else about Egyptian daily life, their religion, their sense of order, even their fears. Without the flood, there was famine. With too much flood, there was destruction, villages washed away, homes ruined. But when the flood came at just the right height, gently rising over the fields and receding at just the right pace, it created some of the most fertile farmland anywhere in the ancient world. A strip of land, in most places only a few miles wide on either side of the river, surrounded by hundreds of miles of nothing. And it was inside this narrow green strip that one of history's longest-lasting civilizations would eventually take root. Now, people had been living along the Nile long before anyone wore a crown or built a pyramid. Archaeological evidence suggests that small farming communities were already established in the Nile Valley by around 5000 BCE, growing wheat and barley, raising cattle, sheep, and goats. These early Egyptians were not yet unified into one kingdom. Instead, they lived in scattered villages, gradually growing into small chiefdoms, then loose regional territories, each with its own local leaders and its own local gods. Life in these early villages would have looked very different from the Egypt most of us picture. There were no grand temples yet, no monumental architecture. Homes were simple structures made from reeds and mud, clustered along the riverbank. Fishing nets were cast into the shallows. Cattle grazed on the floodplain grass. Children played in the mud near the water's edge, probably being called back by their mothers with the same mild exasperation parents have used for thousands of years since. But even in these early centuries, something important was already forming. The unpredictability of desert life, surrounded by hostile terrain on every side, seems to have pushed these early communities toward cooperation. Managing the floodwaters efficiently, digging irrigation channels, coordinating planting and harvest around the Nile's rhythm, these were not tasks a single family could easily manage alone. They required organization. They required people willing to work together, and eventually, people willing to be led. Over the following centuries, small settlements grew into larger towns. Local leaders grew into regional rulers. And slowly, almost like separate droplets of water finding each other and merging into a single stream, Egypt began sorting itself into two loose territories: a southern kingdom, Upper Egypt, with its center of power near a city called Nekhen, and a northern kingdom, Lower Egypt, based in the wide, marshy delta region. We don't know all the details of exactly how or why these two regions began to see themselves as distinct kingdoms. Much of what we understand about this period comes from later Egyptian tradition and from archaeological evidence that is still being pieced together today. But by around 3200 to 3100 BCE, Egypt seems to have consisted of these two rival territories, each with its own symbols, its own patron deities, and its own sense of identity. Upper Egypt in the south associated itself with the white crown and looked to the vulture goddess Nekhbit for protection. Lower Egypt in the north wore the red crown and looked to the cobra goddess Wajet. And for a time, these two Egypts existed side by side, trading, occasionally clashing, evolving along parallel paths, until something happened that would change the shape of the entire region forever. Someone united them. The two lands become one. The story of Egypt's unification is one of those moments in history where the evidence we have is just clear enough to tell us something happened, and just incomplete enough that we can't be entirely sure of every detail. Around 3100 BCE, give or take, the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were brought together under a single ruler. Later Egyptian tradition credited this to a king named Menes. But archaeologists have also uncovered artifacts pointing to a king named Narmer, and many historians today believe Narmer and Menes were likely the same person, known by two different names, or that Menes may represent a slightly later ruler who finished consolidating what Narmer began. It's a reminder that even foundational moments in ancient history often come to us slightly blurred, pieced together from fragments rather than handed down whole. The clearest evidence we have comes from an object known as the Narmer palette, a flat ceremonial stone slab, carved on both sides, discovered in the late 19th century at the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. On the other, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. In one striking image, he is depicted raising a mace above a kneeling enemy, a common symbol in Egyptian art representing the triumph of order over chaos, rather than necessarily a literal historical event we can point to and say, this exact battle happened on this exact day. What we can say with more confidence is that sometime around this period, Egypt transitioned from two separate territories into one unified kingdom, ruled by a single king who wore both crowns, sometimes combined into a single double crown called the Peshent, symbolizing his authority over both the Red Land and the Black Land, both halves of Egypt now understood as one. This moment mattered enormously, not just politically, but philosophically. For the rest of Egyptian history, kings would be remembered and judged, at least in part, by how well they maintained this unity. The idea of the two lands became baked into royal titles, temple inscriptions, and religious imagery for the next 3,000 years. Even pharaohs who ruled long after Narmer's time, separated from him by more centuries than separate us from the Roman Empire, still described themselves using titles that reference the joining of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's a little like if the United States still formally referenced the original 13 colonies in every president's title, thousands of years after the fact. With unification came the beginning of what historians call the early dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2686 BCE. This era set foundations that would last for the rest of Egyptian civilization. A capital was established at Memphis, strategically placed near the point where the Nile Delta begins to fan out, essentially at the hinge between Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis would remain one of Egypt's most important cities for thousands of years afterward, even as political power occasionally shifted elsewhere. During this period, writing was also developing rapidly. Hieroglyphic script, which had likely emerged sometime slightly before unification, began to be used more extensively for religious, administrative, and royal purposes. We'll spend more time later exploring what writing actually meant for how Egyptian society functioned, but it's worth pausing here to notice something remarkable. Writing gave these early kings a tool no chieftain or tribal leader before them had really possessed at scale: the ability to record laws, taxes, religious rituals, and royal achievements in a form that could outlast a human lifetime, could be read by administrators in distant provinces, and could shape how future generations understood the reign of a king long after he had died. Religion, too, was solidifying during this early period, though not in the form of one single unified religious doctrine. Instead, Egypt developed what we might call a layered religious identity. Local gods, worshipped in specific cities and regions since long before unification, did not disappear. Instead, they were gradually woven into a broader religious framework that connected local traditions to the authority of the king. The pharaoh himself began to be understood not simply as a powerful ruler, but as something closer to a living link between the human world and the divine, associated closely with the falcon god Horus, who represented kingship itself. This idea, that the king was somehow more than an ordinary man, would become one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization for the rest of its history. It's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's genuinely different from how many of us instinctively think about political power today. The pharaoh wasn't simply an administrator or a military leader who happened to sit at the top of a hierarchy. He was considered essential to the functioning of the universe itself, responsible for maintaining a concept the Egyptians called mad. Mad is one of those words that doesn't translate cleanly into English, and we'll come back to it more than once throughout this journey, because it sits underneath almost everything in Egyptian thought. At its simplest, Ma'at meant truth, balance, and cosmic order, the idea that the universe naturally wanted to exist in a state of harmony, and that chaos was always waiting at the edges, ready to creep back in if that order wasn't actively maintained. The king's most sacred duty, more important than any war he might fight or any building he might construct, was to uphold Ma'at. Every temple ritual, every judgment handed down in a legal dispute, every successful harvest, was in some sense connected to whether the king was fulfilling this responsibility correctly. It's a strikingly different way of thinking about a ruler's job description. Imagine if we still believed, even symbolically, that a head of state's primary responsibility wasn't economic policy or foreign relations, but literally holding the fabric of the universe together against the threat of chaos. That was, in a very real sense, what an Egyptian believed their king was doing every single day. By the end of the early dynastic period, Egypt had a unified territory, a functioning bureaucracy, an emerging system of writing, a capital city, and a religious framework that placed the king at the very center of cosmic order. All the foundational pieces were now in place. And what came next would be one of the most extraordinary architectural chapters in human history, a period when Egyptian rulers began building structures so massive, so mathematically precise, and so enduring that thousands of years later, we're still trying to fully understand how they managed it. It's time to talk about the pyramids. The age of pyramids. If you close your eyes and picture ancient Egypt, there's a good chance the first image that comes to mind is a pyramid, standing alone against a golden desert horizon. And that instinct isn't wrong. The pyramids remain, even now, one of the most astonishing achievements in human history. But it's worth understanding how they actually came to be, because the story is a little more gradual and a little more human than the finished monuments might suggest. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, is often called the Age of the Pyramids, and for good reason. This was the period when Egyptian kings began channeling the resources of an entire kingdom into constructing monumental tombs, structures meant to secure their place in the afterlife and project the power of their reign for eternity. The very first pyramid wasn't the smooth-sided structure most people picture. It was something called a step pyramid, built for a king named Djoser sometime around 2650 BCE at Saqqara near Memphis. Before Djoser's reign, Egyptian kings were typically buried in flat rectangular structures called mastabas, low, bench-shaped tombs made of mudbrick. Djoser's architect, a man named Imhotep, had an idea. What if you stacked several mastabas on top of each other, each one slightly smaller than the one below, creating a step structure that rose in stages toward the sky? The result was the step pyramid of Djoser, the first large-scale stone building in Egyptian history, and quite possibly one of the first monumental stone structures anywhere in the world. Imhotep himself became something of a legendary figure in later Egyptian memory. Centuries after his death, he was actually deified, worshipped as a god associated with wisdom, medicine, and architecture, an almost unheard of honor for someone who began his career as, essentially, a royal official and architect rather than a king or a deity by birth. Over the following decades, Egyptian architects continued to experiment. There's a fascinating structure at Meidum, and another known as the Bent Pyramid at Dashur, built for a king named Sneferu, that appear to represent trial and error in real time. The Bent Pyramid, if you look at images of it, has an unmistakable kink partway up its sides, where the angle of the walls abruptly changes. Historians generally believe this happened because the original angle was too steep, and the structure began showing signs of instability during construction, forcing the builders to adjust the slope partway through to prevent collapse. It's a small, human detail, hidden inside one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world, engineers realizing partway through a massive project that their math needed correcting, and doing exactly that instead of pretending everything was fine. Sneferu apparently learned from this. His next pyramid project, known today as the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, is considered the first successful true smooth-sided pyramid in Egyptian history, its walls a single consistent angle rising cleanly to a point. And then came his son, Khufu, who reigned sometime around 2560 BCE, commissioned what would become the largest pyramid ever built in Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza. When it was completed, it stood roughly 481 feet tall, and it held the record as the tallest man-made structure on Earth for well over 3,000 years, a record that wasn't surpassed until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 14th century CE, and even that comparison depends on exactly how you measure certain spires. Let that sink in for a moment. A structure built using bronze tools, wooden sledges, ramps, and human labor, without any of the machinery we now take for granted, remained the tallest building on the planet for longer than most modern countries have existed. The Great Pyramid was built using an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone, many of them weighing several tons each, some considerably more. Exactly how the Egyptians managed to quarry, transport, and precisely position all of this stone remains a subject of genuine scholarly discussion. We know they used ramps of some kind, likely a combination of straight ramps and ramps that wound around the structure as it rose, though the exact configuration is still debated among archaeologists and engineers. We know they used sledges to drag heavy stones across the desert, and that wetting the sand in front of the sledges, an experiment actually tested by modern researchers, appears to significantly reduce friction, which may explain some ancient Egyptian tomb paintings that show water being poured in front of sledges being pulled by teams of workers. Here's something that tends to surprise people. The pyramids were not built by slaves in the way popular imagination has long assumed, at least not according to the archaeological evidence uncovered at workers' villages near Giza. Excavations led by archaeologists including Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass have uncovered the remains of a substantial workers' town near the pyramid site, complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and evidence of a workforce that appears to have been organized, fed, and housed in an intentional and fairly well-resourced manner. Skeletal remains show evidence of healed broken bones, suggesting workers received medical care rather than being discarded when injured. It appears likely that the workforce was largely made up of Egyptian laborers, possibly organized on a rotational basis tied to the agricultural calendar, working during the months when the Nile flood made farming impossible anyway, alongside a smaller number of permanent skilled craftsmen, engineers, and overseers. This doesn't mean the work wasn't hard. It absolutely was. But it appears to have functioned more like a massive, centrally organized public works project, something closer to a national undertaking with religious meaning attached to it, rather than a system of forced foreign slave labor as it was often portrayed in 19th and 20th century popular culture. Let's imagine, for a moment, what an ordinary day might have looked like for one of these workers. He wakes before dawn in a mudbrick dormitory, the air still cool. Someone nearby is already working dough for the day's bread. He eats quickly, gathers with the rest of his crew, and receives his assignment for the day, perhaps hauling stone, perhaps working with the teams responsible for precise leveling and alignment, perhaps supporting the skilled masons who fit each stone block into place with a precision that modern engineers still find remarkable, given the tools available at the time. The sun climbs, the heat becomes intense by midday, and work likely paused during the hottest hours, resuming again as the temperature dropped in the late afternoon. In the evening, there would have been beer, a genuine daily ration for workers rather than a luxury, along with bread, onions, and occasionally fish or meat. There's something quietly moving about picturing this. Thousands of ordinary Egyptians, whose individual names have mostly been lost to time, spending years of their working lives contributing to a structure that would still be standing, still drawing wonder from visitors, nearly 4,500 years later. We know almost nothing about most of them as individuals. But we know they existed. We know approximately how they lived during this project. And in a very real sense, every time someone today stands at the base of the Great Pyramid and looks up, they are looking at the accumulated effort of thousands of anonymous lives. Khufu's pyramid was followed by others at Giza, built for his son Khafre and later King Menkaure, along with the famous Great Sphinx, a massive limestone statue with the body of a lion, and most likely the face of Khafre himself, though this attribution has been debated by scholars over the years. Together, these three pyramids and their surrounding structures formed the Giza Plateau as we recognize it today, though it's worth remembering that in its original state, the pyramids would have been covered in a smooth, polished white limestone casing, gleaming brightly under the desert sun, quite different from the somewhat weathered, exposed stone visible today. Most of that original casing was later removed over the centuries and reused for other building projects, particularly in medieval Cairo. As the Old Kingdom progressed, pyramid building continued under subsequent rulers, though never quite reaching the scale of Giza again. And gradually, as we'll see, this era of centralized power and monumental construction began to strain under its own weight, both literally and politically. But before we follow that story to its conclusion, let's step away from kings and monuments entirely for a while, and spend some time with the people who lived in the shadow of all this, the ordinary Egyptians whose daily lives rarely made it into royal inscriptions, but who made up the overwhelming majority of everyone who ever called this civilization home. Life along the river lets leave the pyramids behind for a while and walk down toward the water. If you had lived in ancient Egypt at almost any point across its 3,000-year history, whether during the Old Kingdom, the New Kingdom, or somewhere in between, there's an overwhelming chance you would not have been a pharaoh, a priest, or a scribe. You would have been a farmer. Somewhere around 80 to 90% of the Egyptian population worked the land in some capacity, and the rhythm of their entire year was dictated by a calendar built around the Nile's flood cycle, rather than the seasons most of us think of today. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons, each roughly 4 months long. There was Akhet, the season of the inundation, when the Nile flooded and covered the fields, making farming impossible but also depositing that rich black silt that made everything else possible. There was Peret, the growing season, when the floodwaters receded and farmers planted their crops in the newly enriched soil. And there was Shemu, the harvest season, when crops were gathered before the heat of summer became too intense and the cycle prepared to begin again. Picture a farmer during Peret, the planting season. The floodwater has just receded from his fields, leaving behind soft, dark mud rather than the cracked, dusty ground you might expect elsewhere in the region. He walks out early, before the heat sets in, carrying a wooden plow that might be pulled by a pair of oxen if his household was fortunate enough to own them, or pulled by hand if not. Seeds, mostly emmer wheat and barley along with flax for linen, would be scattered across the freshly turned soil. In some depictions from Egyptian tomb paintings, Farmers are shown driving pigs or sheep across the fields after planting, their hooves pressing the seeds down into the soft mud, an efficient, low-effort method of ensuring good soil contact. There is something worth noticing here, a detail that easily gets lost. Egyptian farming, at least along the immediate floodplain, did not require the same intensity of irrigation labor that many other ancient agricultural societies needed. The Nile did much of the hard work automatically, flooding the fields and depositing fertile soil without requiring farmers to constantly dig channels or haul water uphill the way farmers in some other ancient river civilizations, like Mesopotamia, often had to. This doesn't mean Egyptian farming was easy. It wasn't. But it did mean that, in a good year with a well-behaved flood, Egyptian agriculture could produce a genuine surplus, more food than the immediate farming population needed to survive. And that surplus is worth pausing on, because it's one of the quiet engines behind everything else we associate with Egyptian civilization: the pyramids, the temples, the armies, the artisans. Surplus food meant some portion of the population could be freed up to do something other than farm. Of course, not every year cooperated. If the flood came too low, crops would fail and famine could follow. If it came too high, homes and villages near the riverbank could be damaged or destroyed. Egyptians developed a tool called a nilometer, essentially a stone structure with marked measurements descending into the water, used to track the height of the flood each year at various points along the river. Priests and officials monitored these measurements closely, because the height of the flood didn't just predict the harvest, it also determined how much tax the state could reasonably collect that year. In a very real sense, one of ancient Egypt's earliest and most important pieces of data collection was simply watching how high the river rose. Now let's step away from the fields and toward home, because farming was only part of daily existence. What did an ordinary Egyptian household actually look like? Most homes, for the majority of the population, were built from mudbrick, a material made by mixing Nile mud with straw and forming it into blocks that were dried in the sun rather than fired in a kiln. This made mudbrick relatively cheap and quick to produce, though it also meant that homes required regular maintenance and were vulnerable to erosion from flooding or heavy rain, on the rare occasions Egypt experienced it. Homes were typically simple, often just a few rooms, with thick walls that helped keep interiors relatively cool during the punishing heat of the day. Roofs were flat, and in many households that flat roof space wasn't wasted. Families used it for storage, for drying grain or laundry, and often, especially in the summer months, for sleeping. On a hot night, the interior of a mudbrick home could feel stifling even after sundown, while the rooftop, open to whatever breeze existed, offered a cooler and more comfortable place to rest. Windows tended to be small and placed high on the walls, which helped limit the amount of direct sun and heat entering the home while still allowing airflow. Floors were typically packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats. Furniture, for most households, was minimal. Wealthier families might have wooden stools, low tables, and storage chests, but many ordinary Egyptians likely sat and slept on mats or low platforms rather than elaborate furniture. Beds, when they existed, were often simple wooden frames strung with woven cord or leather strips, topped with a headrest made of wood, stone, or ivory rather than the soft pillows we might expect. This might sound uncomfortable to modern ears, but headrests were actually a widespread and enduring feature of Egyptian life across social classes, found in tombs ranging from modest burials to the tomb of Tutankhamun himself, suggesting they were considered a normal, even necessary, part of a good night's sleep, not a hardship. Cooking generally happened outdoors, or in a partially open area of the home, both because of the heat generated by cooking fires and to reduce smoke buildup indoors. A simple clay oven, sometimes shaped almost like a beehive, was used for baking bread, which brings us to something we'll spend real time on shortly, because bread and beer together formed the true backbone of the Egyptian diet, so central to daily survival that the hieroglyphic symbols for bread and beer were sometimes used together almost as shorthand for the basic necessities of life itself. Families in ancient Egypt tended to be structured around the household as an economic unit as much as an emotional one, though this doesn't mean warmth and affection were absent. Quite the opposite, actually, as we'll see when we look more closely at Egyptian family life shortly. Multiple generations sometimes lived together or nearby, and households often included extended relatives, not just a single nuclear family. Marriage in ancient Egypt did not typically involve elaborate religious or state ceremony in the way we might expect. Instead, it seems to have functioned more as a recognized social and economic arrangement, formalized primarily through a couple beginning to live together and through agreements about property, particularly regarding what a woman brought into the household and what she would retain if the marriage ended. And this brings up something genuinely notable about Egyptian society compared to many other ancient civilizations. Egyptian women held a comparatively strong legal position. They could own property independently, enter into contracts, initiate divorce, and appear as parties in legal disputes, rights that were not universally extended to women in many neighboring ancient societies. This doesn't mean Egyptian society was equal in every sense we might use that word today. Political power, priesthood at the highest levels, and most formal government positions remained overwhelmingly dominated by men. But within the household and in matters of property and legal standing, Egyptian women had a degree of independence that surprised even ancient visitors from other cultures. The Greek historian Herodotus, in fact, wrote with evident astonishment about how Egyptian gender roles in daily commercial life seemed reversed compared to what he was used to in Greece, describing Egyptian women engaging in trade and business in the marketplace while, in his account, men remained home weaving cloth, though modern historians treat some of his more sweeping generalizations with appropriate caution, since Herodotus was, after all, a foreign visitor describing a culture not his own, sometimes relying on second-hand accounts and a certain amount of exoticizing exaggeration. As evening settled over a farming village, the pace of life would slow, the heat of the day would ease, cooking fires would be lit again for the evening meal. Children, having spent the day helping with smaller chores, or in some cases simply playing along the riverbank or among the animals, would be called home. And as darkness fell, with no electric light to push it back, the household would gather close, lit by the warm, flickering glow of simple oil lamps, small clay vessels holding oil and a wick, casting soft shadows across mudbrick walls. It's worth pausing on this detail, the darkness itself, because it shaped daily rhythm in a way that's genuinely difficult for those of us living with electric light to fully appreciate. When the sun went down in ancient Egypt, the world did not continue at the same pace. Activities wound down, conversations grew quieter, people went to sleep earlier and woke earlier, guided almost entirely by the rising and setting of the sun rather than an artificial schedule imposed on top of it. There is a kind of peace in that, even if it also came with real limitations, since after dark there was little that could be safely or comfortably done beyond resting, eating, or quiet conversation by lamplight. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again over the fields, over the river, over villages that had followed this same basic rhythm for generation after generation. And in the next part of this journey, let's step a little closer into what actually filled the Egyptian table, because the food they grew, prepared, and shared tells us just as much about their world as any temple or tomb ever could. Bread, beer, and the Egyptian table, there's a particular smell that most historians agree would have drifted through nearly every Egyptian settlement, wealthy or poor, almost every single day. Baking bread. It's easy to underestimate just how central bread was to Egyptian life, but the evidence is everywhere, in tomb paintings showing bakers at work, in the remains of ancient bakeries excavated near workers' villages, and in the sheer volume of bread-related vocabulary that appears throughout Egyptian texts. The basic grains grown in Egypt were emmer wheat and barley, and between them, they formed the foundation of the entire diet. Emmer wheat was primarily used for bread, while barley was used both for bread and, just as importantly, for brewing beer. And when we say beer was important in ancient Egypt, we genuinely mean essential, not simply a pleasant beverage enjoyed occasionally. Beer in ancient Egypt was thick, nutritious, relatively low in alcohol compared to modern beer, and consumed by essentially everyone in the population, including children, since it was often safer and more nutritionally reliable than the available water, which could carry waterborne illness. It was also a significant source of calories and nutrients in a diet that, for most ordinary people, did not include a great deal of meat. Workers, including the laborers who built the pyramids we discussed earlier, received beer as part of their standard daily rations, alongside bread. This wasn't considered indulgent or excessive. It was simply understood as a basic component of a working diet, roughly equivalent to how we might think of providing regular meals to employees today. Bread itself came in a surprising variety of forms. Some was flat and simple, similar to what we might recognize as flatbread today. Other forms were denser, sometimes sweetened with dates or honey, sometimes shaped into distinctive forms for religious offerings. Archaeologists have identified dozens of different bread shapes and recipes from tomb paintings and preserved remains, suggesting that even something as basic as bread carried real variety and even a degree of culinary creativity. Grinding grain into flour was extremely labor-intensive, typically done by hand using stone grinding tools, and this task fell primarily to women within a household, or to dedicated servants and workers in wealthier households and larger institutional settings like temples and worker communities. It's worth pausing on this, because it represents hours of daily physical labor that rarely gets mentioned when we talk about ancient Egypt in broad historical strokes. Grinding enough flour to feed a family, day after day, year after year, was genuinely hard, repetitive physical work, and it fell overwhelmingly on the shoulders of women. Interestingly, skeletal analysis of ancient Egyptian remains has revealed a pattern of wear on certain bones, particularly in the knees, back, and toes of women, consistent with the repeated kneeling and grinding motion this work required. In other words, we can actually see the physical cost of this labor written into the bones of the people who performed it, thousands of years after the fact. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet included a wide range of vegetables. Onions and garlic were staples, believed by some Egyptians to have medicinal or even protective properties, and they appear frequently in tomb offerings and food remains. Leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, and legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans were also common. Along the riverbanks and in the marshy areas of the delta, papyrus reeds grew abundantly. And while papyrus is best known today for its use in writing material, which we'll get to, it also had various practical uses in daily life, including as food in some circumstances, and as material for baskets, sandals, boats, and rope. Fruit was available seasonally, including dates, figs, and pomegranates, which were introduced to Egypt at various points and became a valued part of the diet and a common motif in art and offerings. Sweetness in the ancient Egyptian diet mostly came from fruit, particularly dates, and from honey, which was carefully cultivated. Beekeeping in Egypt has a documented history stretching back thousands of years, with evidence of organized apiaries and honey production appearing in art and administrative records from the Old Kingdom onward. Fish, drawn directly from the Nile, was a significant protein source for much of the population, particularly those living closer to the river itself. Species like tilapia, catfish, and perch were commonly caught, and fishing appears frequently in Egyptian tomb art, sometimes shown as a leisurely activity for the wealthy, and elsewhere shown as serious, essential labor for those who depended on it for survival. Fish could be eaten fresh, but was also commonly dried or salted for preservation, an important consideration in a climate where refrigeration obviously did not exist and food needed to last. Meat, on the other hand, was more of a luxury for most of the population. Cattle, in particular, were expensive to raise and maintain, and beef appears to have been reserved primarily for wealthier households, temple offerings, and special occasions, rather than everyday meals for ordinary farmers. Poultry, including geese and ducks, which were both hunted in the wild along the marshy edges of the Nile and raised domestically, appears to have been somewhat more accessible across different social classes than beef. Pigs were also raised in some regions, though their status in Egyptian religious and dietary customs appears to have varied over time and by region, occasionally carrying some negative religious associations, though this was not consistent or universal across all periods of Egyptian history. For most ordinary Egyptians, then, a typical meal likely consisted of bread, perhaps flavored with onion or garlic, alongside beer, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, and occasionally fish, with meat reserved for special occasions or reserved primarily for the wealthy. It's a diet that in many ways would look recognizable and reasonably healthy by many modern nutritional standards, built around whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and moderate protein, though obviously without any of the variety and imported ingredients we take for granted today. Salt, used both for flavor and preservation, was available from natural deposits, and Egypt also had access to natron, a naturally occurring mineral compound that we'll encounter again later in a very different context when we talk about mummification. In daily life, though, natron was also used as a kind of early soap or cleaning agent. Cooking equipment for most households was fairly simple. Clay pots for boiling stews of vegetables and legumes, simmering over an open fire or in a small clay oven, alongside the bread baking ovens mentioned earlier. There is something worth imagining here. A woman crouched near a small fire in the cool part of an early evening, stirring a pot of lentils and onions, the smell mixing with wood smoke and the ever-present scent of fresh bread from earlier in the day, while somewhere nearby children wait, perhaps a little impatiently, the way children have always waited for dinner to be ready throughout human history. Mealtime itself, for ordinary families, appears to have been a relatively communal, informal affair, likely eaten seated on mats or low stools rather than at a formal table in the way we might picture today, though wealthier households certainly had access to proper furniture and more elaborate dining customs. Egyptian art occasionally depicts banquet scenes among the elite, showing guests seated, being served food and drink by servants, sometimes accompanied by musicians. These scenes give us a glimpse of how celebration and hospitality functioned among the wealthy, even if they represent only a small fraction of how most Egyptians actually experienced daily meals. Food, in ancient Egypt, was never simply about survival either. It carried deep religious and symbolic weight as well. Offerings of bread, beer, meat, and produce were a fundamental part of temple ritual and funerary practice, based on the belief that the deceased continued to require sustenance in the afterlife, a topic we'll return to in much greater depth later in this journey. Tomb walls throughout Egyptian history are covered with detailed depictions of food offerings, sometimes accompanied by written lists specifying exactly what should be provided, a kind of eternal shopping list intended to magically sustain the dead forever, regardless of whether actual physical offerings continued to be brought after the funeral itself. As we step back now from the Egyptian table, it's worth carrying forward one simple observation. For all the grandeur we associate with pyramids, gold, and pharaohs, the actual daily experience of most Egyptians revolved around something far more universal: working to grow food, working to prepare it, and sharing it with family as the sun went down. In that sense, despite everything that separates their world from ours by thousands of years of history and technology, there is something quietly familiar about an Egyptian family gathering at the end of a long day to share bread and a simple meal together. Now, let's turn to the people who filled these homes and look more closely at how families were structured, how children grew up, and what it actually meant to build a life in ancient Egypt. Family, children, and the Egyptian home. Family sat at the very center of Egyptian life, in a way that shaped nearly every aspect of how society was organized, from inheritance and property to religion, and even how people imagined the afterlife itself. Marriage, as we touched on earlier, was less a religious ceremony and more a recognized social and legal arrangement. Most Egyptians appear to have married relatively young by modern standards, with girls often marrying in their early to mid-teens and men typically a few years older, once they were established enough economically to support a household. This might sound unfamiliar or even uncomfortable to modern ears, but it's important to understand it within its own context, rather than judging it against contemporary norms. Life expectancy in ancient Egypt was considerably shorter than today, and establishing a family early was simply a practical reality of how society functioned, not unlike patterns seen across much of the ancient and even medieval world. Within royal and elite circles, marriages sometimes served important political or dynastic purposes, and we do know of instances of sibling marriage among Egyptian royalty, particularly in certain periods, most famously with some Ptolemaic rulers much later in Egyptian history. This practice, however, appears to have been largely restricted to royal families seeking to preserve dynastic legitimacy and consolidate divine bloodlines, rather than a common practice among ordinary Egyptians, for whom such marriages would have been unusual. For most families, children were considered an enormous blessing, and Egyptian texts and prayers frequently reflect deep hopes for fertility and healthy children. Given the realities of ancient medicine, Infant and child mortality rates were tragically high by modern standards, and this shadow of loss touches a great deal of Egyptian religious practice and personal correspondence that has survived. Letters between family members occasionally reveal genuine, tender anxiety about a child's illness or grief following a child's death, reminding us that despite the vast gulf of time separating us from these people, parental love and fear for a child's well-being was every bit as real and immediate for them as it is for any parent today. Childhood itself, for those fortunate enough to survive its early dangers, appears to have involved a mixture of work and play, gradually shifting toward more responsibility as children grew older. Young children in farming households would have helped with lighter tasks, minding smaller siblings, helping to prepare food, tending to animals, or assisting with simple household chores. As they grew older, boys in farming families would increasingly join their fathers in the fields, learning agricultural work directly, while girls would take on more responsibility within the household, learning skills like cooking, weaving, and childcare from their mothers and other female relatives. But it wasn't only ever work. Archaeological finds have uncovered toys belonging to Egyptian children, including wooden animals with movable parts, dolls, balls, and board games. One particularly well-documented board game, called Senet, was popular across Egyptian society, from ordinary households to royal palaces, and appears to have been enjoyed by both children and adults. It's a small, comforting detail to imagine a family in the evening, perhaps after the day's work was finished and the meal had been eaten, sitting together by lamplight, playing a board game whose exact rules have only been partially reconstructed by modern historians, since ancient instructions for how it was played have never survived intact. Education, in the more formal sense that we tend to associate with the word today, was not universal in ancient Egypt. Most children, particularly those from farming families, would have learned their skills directly through observation and practice within the family unit, rather than through formal schooling. Formal education, particularly in reading, writing, and mathematics, was largely reserved for boys from families wealthy enough or connected enough to pursue training as scribes, a path we'll explore more closely later, since it represented one of the most significant routes towards social mobility available in Egyptian society. This doesn't mean girls received no education at all. Evidence suggests that at least some girls, particularly from wealthier households, may have received informal education, and there is evidence of literate women throughout Egyptian history, though formal scribal training as an institutional path appears to have been overwhelmingly directed toward boys. Family structures extended well beyond the immediate household. Egyptian society placed considerable value on maintaining relationships with extended family, and evidence from letters and legal documents suggests that grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins often remained closely involved in family life, sometimes living nearby or even within the same household compound. Elderly family members were generally expected to be cared for by their children, and Egyptian religious and ethical texts frequently emphasize the importance of honoring one's parents, a value that appears consistently across surviving wisdom literature. Texts intended to offer moral and practical guidance, somewhat similar in spirit to proverbs found in other ancient literary traditions. One particularly moving piece of surviving wisdom literature, known as the Instructions of Ptahhotep, believed to date to the Old Kingdom period, offers advice on proper conduct, respect for parents, humility, and fair treatment of others, phrased in a way that feels surprisingly personal and relatable even across the gulf of more than 4,000 years. It's worth remembering, when we imagine ancient Egypt, that these were not simply distant historical abstractions building monuments and worshipping strange gods. They were people who worried about raising their children well, who valued kindness and integrity, who wrote down guidance for how to live a good life. Guidance that, in many respects, would not feel entirely out of place if translated into a modern self-help book. Names themselves carried real meaning in Egyptian culture, often reflecting religious devotion, physical characteristics, or hopes for the child's future. Many names directly invoked specific gods, such as names built around the god Amun or the sun god Ra, reflecting a family's religious devotion or connection to a particular deity, sometimes tied to a specific region where that god was especially venerated. Death, unfortunately, touched Egyptian families with painful regularity, given the medical realities of the ancient world. Beyond high childhood mortality, adults also faced serious risks from disease, injury, and complications during childbirth, which represented one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life throughout most of ancient history. Egyptian medicine, which we'll explore in more detail later, was surprisingly advanced in certain areas, particularly surgery and the setting of broken bones, but remained limited against infectious disease and the general risks of childbirth by modern standards. And yet, despite these hardships, the overall picture that emerges from Egyptian art, literature, and archaeology is not one of grim resignation, but of genuine warmth and affection within family life. Tomb paintings frequently depict husbands and wives seated closely together, sometimes with an arm affectionately placed around a shoulder, a detail that Egyptian artists clearly considered worth including, suggesting these images were meant to represent, and perhaps preserve for eternity, genuine loving relationships, rather than simply formal dynastic arrangements. Depictions of family life in tombs often include children playing nearby, pets such as cats, dogs, and even monkeys included in domestic scenes, and small, tender details that suggest these were images meant to celebrate a life well lived among people who were loved, not simply administrative records of a household's existence. It's worth pausing here on the topic of pets specifically, since it tends to delight people when they first learn about it. Cats, in particular, held a genuinely special place in Egyptian society, eventually becoming associated with protective qualities and with specific deities, most notably the goddess Bastet, who came to be depicted with the head of a cat and was associated with protection, fertility, and the home. Killing a cat, even accidentally, appears to have been treated with real seriousness in Egyptian society, and Herodotus, in his accounts of Egypt, described the extraordinary lengths some Egyptians would go to protect cats from danger, even during house fires, prioritizing the safety of the animals to a degree that struck him as remarkable. Whether every detail Herodotus recorded should be taken at complete face value is something historians continue to debate, since he was, again, a foreign observer relying partly on second-hand information. But the underlying cultural reverence for cats in Egyptian society is well supported by both religious art and archaeological evidence, including the discovery of enormous numbers of mummified cats at certain religious sites, offered as devotional gifts to Bastet. Dogs, too, were valued companions, kept for hunting, guarding property, and simple companionship, and were sometimes given individual names recorded in inscriptions, a small but touching detail suggesting these animals were regarded as genuine members of the household rather than merely functional tools. As we picture an Egyptian household settling in for the evening, then, imagine not just the practical rhythms of farming, cooking, and daily labor we discussed earlier, but the emotional texture layered underneath it. Parents watching over children with the same mixture of pride, worry, and love that any parent recognizes today. A cat curled near the warmth of a dying cooking fire. An elderly grandparent, cared for and respected within the household, perhaps offering the same kind of practical wisdom and gentle guidance that grandparents have offered to grandchildren throughout human history. It is, in many ways, a deeply familiar picture, even though it unfolded thousands of years ago, under a very different sky. Now that we've spent some time inside the Egyptian home, let's step back outside and look upward, toward the gods who filled Egyptian religious life, shaping everything from the rhythm of the calendar to the deepest hopes people carried about what waited for them after death. Gods of the Nile. Egyptian religion is one of those subjects that can seem, at first glance, almost overwhelming in its complexity. There were hundreds of recognized deities across Egyptian history, some worshipped nationally, others honored primarily within a single city or region, some rising to enormous prominence during certain periods only to fade into the background during others. But underneath this complexity, there's a coherent way of understanding how Egyptians actually experienced their gods, not as distant, abstract figures confined to temple walls, but as forces woven directly into the fabric of everyday existence. Let's start with the sun, since it's hard to imagine a civilization more attuned to it than Egypt. The sun god, most commonly known as Ra, held a position of enormous importance throughout Egyptian religious history. Ra was believed to travel across the sky each day in a solar bark, a divine boat, and then journey through the dangerous underworld each night before rising again at dawn. This daily cycle, the sun's death and rebirth, became one of the most powerful and recurring symbols in all of Egyptian religious thought, closely tied to ideas about mortality, renewal, and the hope of life continuing beyond death. During the night journey, Ra was believed to face constant danger from a chaotic serpent deity named Apep, sometimes called Apophis, who represented the forces of chaos attempting to prevent the sun from rising again. Every single sunrise in this worldview represented a genuine cosmic victory, order triumphing over chaos once again, a battle that had to be fought and won every single night without exception. It's a beautiful, almost poetic way of understanding something as ordinary as daybreak, transforming it from a simple astronomical event into a daily act of cosmic significance. Osiris represents another central figure in Egyptian religious thought, and his story touches almost every aspect of how Egyptians understood death and the afterlife. According to Egyptian mythology, Osiris was once a king who ruled over Egypt during a mythical golden age, teaching humanity agriculture and civilization itself. His jealous brother, Set, murdered him, and in most versions of the myth, dismembered his body and scattered the pieces. Osiris's devoted wife, Isis, gathered his remains and, through powerful magic, managed to briefly restore him to life, long enough to conceive a son, Horus, before Osiris passed into the realm of the dead, becoming the ruler of the afterlife itself. This myth carried enormous weight throughout Egyptian civilization. Osiris became closely associated with resurrection and the promise of continued existence after death, and the pharaoh himself, upon dying, was frequently identified with Osiris, believed to undergo a similar process of death and rebirth into eternal life. Meanwhile, the reigning living pharaoh was closely associated with Horus, the son who avenged his father and rightfully claimed the throne, reinforcing the idea of continuous, legitimate kingship passed down through a sacred lineage, generation after generation. Isis, for her part, grew into one of the most beloved and enduring deities in Egyptian religion, associated with magic, motherhood, and protection. Her devotion to Osiris and her fierce protection of her son Horus resonated deeply within Egyptian culture, and her worship would eventually spread well beyond Egypt's borders, continuing even into the Roman period, when temples to Isis could be found throughout the Mediterranean world, a testament to how far-reaching and enduring her appeal had become. Set, the antagonist of this central myth, occupied a genuinely complicated position within Egyptian religion. He was associated with chaos, violence, and the harsh, unpredictable desert. But it would be a mistake to think of Set simply as an Egyptian version of a devil figure. In earlier periods of Egyptian history, Set was actually worshipped with real reverence, seen as a necessary force, representing the chaotic, dangerous elements of existence that had to be acknowledged and respected rather than simply condemned. His reputation did shift over time, becoming increasingly negative in later periods of Egyptian history. But this evolution itself tells us something valuable, that Egyptian religion was not a fixed, unchanging system handed down once and never altered, but a living tradition that shifted and adapted across 3,000 years, responding to changing political and cultural circumstances. Then there is Amun, whose importance grew enormously during certain periods, particularly once the city of Thebes rose to prominence during the Middle and New Kingdoms. Amun, whose name is often translated as meaning something like the Hidden One, became associated with the very concept of divine power that existed beyond ordinary human perception or comprehension. Over time, Amun became merged with Ra in the form of Amun-Ra, combining the qualities of hidden, all-encompassing divine power with the visible, life-giving force of the sun itself. Amun-Ra eventually became recognized as something close to a supreme deity, particularly during the New Kingdom period, worshipped in the enormous temple complex at Karnak near Thebes, which grew over centuries into one of the largest religious structures ever constructed in the ancient world. Hathor, often depicted as a cow, or as a woman with cow horns cradling a sun disk, was associated with love, beauty, motherhood, music, and joy. She represented one of the warmer, more approachable aspects of Egyptian divinity, closely connected to celebration and the pleasures of life, and she was especially beloved among ordinary Egyptians, who often sought her blessing in matters of love, fertility, and family happiness. Anubis, recognizable by his jackal head, held a particularly important role connected to death and mummification, believed to guide the souls of the deceased through the dangerous journey of the afterlife, and to preside over the crucial process of judgment that awaited every soul, a moment we'll examine closely later in this journey, when we explore Egyptian beliefs about death in greater depth. Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis bird, or sometimes as a baboon, was associated with wisdom, writing, and knowledge, considered the inventor of hieroglyphic script itself according to Egyptian tradition, and closely connected to scribes, who regarded him as their patron deity. And then there was Bastet, whom we already touched on briefly, the protective cat goddess associated with the home, fertility, and warding off evil, beloved particularly by ordinary families seeking her protection over their households. This is, admittedly, only a small sampling of the vast Egyptian pantheon. There were gods associated with the Nile flood itself, such as Hapi, gods associated with specific crafts and professions, gods tied to individual cities and regions, and gods whose importance rose and fell as political power shifted between different centers of Egyptian civilization over the centuries. What's important to understand is that Egyptian religion was not experienced as a rigid, singular belief system, handed down from a single sacred text, the way many people today might think of religion. It was, instead, a rich, layered, regionally varied tradition that most Egyptians experienced through participation, festivals, offerings, protective amulets worn on the body, and prayers whispered during moments of daily hardship or hope, rather than through formal theological doctrine debated and settled once and for all. For an ordinary Egyptian farmer or craftsman, religion was not something confined to occasional temple visits. It was woven into daily existence itself. A small protective amulet might be worn to guard against illness or misfortune. A quick prayer might be offered before a journey or before childbirth, invoking a specific deity associated with protection during exactly that kind of danger. Household shrines, sometimes quite modest, allowed ordinary families to make small offerings and prayers without needing to travel to a grand temple, which, as we'll discuss shortly, was often not even accessible to ordinary people in the way we might expect. This last point deserves a moment of its own, because it genuinely surprises people the first time they hear it. The great temples of Egypt, the massive stone complexes we still marvel at today, were not primarily public gathering spaces the way we might imagine a modern church or mosque functioning. Ordinary Egyptians were generally not permitted into the innermost sanctuaries of these temples at all. So what exactly happened inside these enormous, carefully guarded religious complexes? And how did ordinary people actually experience their gods if the grandest temples were largely closed to them? That's exactly where we're headed next. Priests, temples, and the unseen world. A great Egyptian temple was not designed the way many of us might picture a religious building today, as a welcoming public space intended to gather large congregations for shared worship. Instead, an Egyptian temple functioned more like the actual house of a god, understood quite literally. The deepest, innermost chamber of the temple contained a statue of the deity, believed to house the god's living presence, and this space was treated with the same kind of restricted access you might imagine surrounding a king's private bedroom, accessible only to a small number of the highest-ranking priests, and on certain ceremonial occasions, the pharaoh himself. The daily rituals performed within these inner sanctuaries were remarkably intimate and almost domestic in nature. Each morning, priests would ritually wake the god's statue, clean it, dress it in fresh linen garments, adorn it with jewelry and perfume, and present offerings of food and drink. Similar rituals were repeated throughout the day, treating the divine statue essentially as a living, honored resident of the temple who required daily care, much like a person of extremely high status would be attended to. This might sound strange to modern religious sensibilities, but it reflects a genuinely different way of understanding the relationship between the divine and the physical world, one where a deity's presence could be housed, cared for, and honored through very tangible, sensory actions, rather than existing purely as an abstract spiritual concept. As the temple complex extended outward from this innermost sanctuary, through successive courtyards and halls, access gradually opened to a slightly wider, though still restricted, group of priests and officials. Only the outermost areas of many temple complexes were ever accessible to the general public, and even then, primarily during specific festivals, when the god's statue might be ceremonially carried outside the temple in a sacred bark, a portable model boat, allowing ordinary people a rare, brief glimpse of the divine presence as it processed through the streets. These festivals represented some of the most significant public events in Egyptian religious and social life. They combined religious devotion with genuine celebration, featuring music, dancing, feasting, and general festivity, offering ordinary Egyptians a rare and treasured opportunity to feel directly connected to their gods and to participate in something larger than their individual daily concerns. One of the most significant of these was the Apet festival at Thebes, during which a statue of Amun was ceremonially transported from the temple at Karnak to the nearby temple at Luxor, accompanied by enormous crowds, music, and celebration, reaffirming the connection between the god, the pharaoh, and the well-being of the entire kingdom. The priesthood itself functioned as a genuinely significant institution within Egyptian society, both religiously and economically. Temples controlled substantial agricultural land, workshops, and resources, and the wealthiest and most powerful temples, particularly during the New Kingdom, commanded resources and influence that rivaled, and at certain points arguably exceeded, that of the pharaoh's own royal administration. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes, in particular, grew so powerful during the later New Kingdom that it became a genuine political force in its own right, a development that, as we'll see later in this journey, contributed to real political tension during certain periods of Egyptian history. Becoming a priest was not necessarily a full-time, lifelong religious calling in the way we might associate with certain religious traditions today. For many priests, particularly at the lower and mid-ranks, temple service functioned on a rotational basis, with priests serving for a set period, perhaps 1 month out of every 4, before returning to other professional or family responsibilities during the remaining time. This rotational system meant that priesthood, at least at these levels, was not entirely separate from ordinary civic life, and many priests maintained other occupations, family responsibilities, and property alongside their religious duties. At the very top of this hierarchy stood high priests, particularly the high priest of Amun at Thebes, whose position carried enormous prestige, wealth, and political influence. These high-ranking religious positions were sometimes held by members of prominent families with close connections to the royal court, and at certain points in Egyptian history, the line between religious and political power became genuinely blurred. Beyond the major state temples dedicated to gods like Amun, Ra, and Osiris, Egypt was also home to countless smaller, local shrines and temples dedicated to regional deities, ancestor worship, and specific local traditions that varied considerably from one part of Egypt to another. This regional religious diversity is easy to overlook when we speak broadly about Egyptian religion, as though it were a single, uniform system. But it's worth remembering that a farmer living in the Nile Delta and a farmer living far to the south, near the first cataract of the Nile, might have experienced meaningfully different local religious traditions, even while both understood themselves as part of the same broader Egyptian cosmological worldview centered on Mad, the pharaoh, and the great state gods. For ordinary Egyptians who couldn't access the great temple's inner sanctuaries, personal religious practice found other outlets. Small household shrines allowed for private devotion. Protective amulets, often depicting specific gods or sacred symbols like the Ankh, representing life, or the scarab beetle, associated with rebirth and transformation, because of its connection to the sun god through Egyptian observations of how dung beetles rolled their eggs, much like the sun rolling across the sky, were worn on the body for protection and blessing. Personal prayers and small offerings left at accessible outer temple courts or local shrines allowed ordinary Egyptians genuine, direct religious participation, even without access to a temple's most sacred inner chambers. Magic, in the Egyptian worldview, was not considered separate from religion in the way modern thinking might draw a sharp distinction between the two. Spells, protective incantations, and ritual objects were understood as legitimate tools for seeking divine protection, healing illness, or ensuring safe passage through dangerous circumstances, whether that danger came in the form of physical illness, difficult childbirth, or the perilous journey through the afterlife that awaited every soul after death. Egyptian medicine itself often combined what we would now separate into distinct categories of practical treatment and religious or magical practice, with physicians sometimes reciting specific protective spells alongside more practical remedies like herbal treatments, wound care, and even surgical procedures, particularly for setting broken bones, a skill Egyptian physicians appear to have developed to a genuinely impressive degree, as evidenced by surviving medical papyri like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes remarkably systematic approaches to diagnosing and treating traumatic injuries. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how sophisticated certain aspects of Egyptian medical knowledge actually were, even while other aspects remain tied to what we would now consider magical or superstitious thinking. This blending of the practical and the spiritual wasn't seen as contradictory by the Egyptians themselves. It simply reflected their broader understanding of a universe where the physical and divine were deeply intertwined, where healing a broken bone and offering a protective prayer were both legitimate, complementary responses to the same underlying problem, restoring balance and order to a body or situation that had fallen out of harmony. As we consider this layered religious world, temples closed to ordinary people, festivals opening brief windows of shared celebration, household shrines allowing daily personal devotion, protective amulets worn against the uncertainties of life, it becomes easier to understand how deeply and completely religion touched nearly every aspect of Egyptian existence, without requiring every individual to have direct access to the grandest religious institutions of their day. But there was one particular institution that touched Egyptian religious and administrative life in an entirely different way, one built not around ritual and devotion, but around a technology that would ultimately allow us, thousands of years later, to understand any of this at all. It's time to talk about writing, and about the people whose entire careers were built around it. Scribes, writing, and the order of if you wanted to build a genuinely successful, secure life in ancient Egypt, one path stood out above almost all others in terms of opportunity and social mobility: becoming a scribe. Egyptian writing developed in two closely related but distinct forms. Hieroglyphic script, the elaborate pictorial writing system most people picture when they think of ancient Egypt, was primarily used for formal, monumental purposes: inscriptions on temple walls, royal tombs, and official monuments, where its visual beauty and symbolic weight carried real importance. But for everyday administrative and practical writing, Egyptian scribes typically used a faster, more simplified script called hieratic, written with a reed pen and ink on papyrus, a material made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile Delta. Producing papyrus was itself a skilled process. The pith of the papyrus stem was cut into thin strips, laid out in overlapping layers at right angles to each other, then pressed and dried, creating a surprisingly durable and smooth writing surface. This innovation gave Egypt a genuine advantage in record-keeping and communication compared to societies relying on heavier, more cumbersome writing materials, and papyrus eventually became a valuable Egyptian export throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Learning to become a scribe required years of dedicated training, typically beginning in childhood, around the age of 5 to 10, depending on the period, at schools generally attached to temples or major administrative centers. Training was rigorous and demanding, involving memorization, extensive copying of texts, and gradually building proficiency in both hieratic script for practical use and hieroglyphic script for more formal purposes. Discipline in these schools appears to have been genuinely strict, and surviving texts occasionally include remarkably candid, almost humorous complaints from students about harsh teachers and the sheer tedium of endless copying exercises, alongside equally candid encouragement from instructors emphasizing that the difficult path of scribal training would ultimately spare a young man from the harsher physical labor endured by farmers, soldiers, and other manual workers. One surviving text, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as the satire of the trades, presents an almost comically exaggerated comparison between the miserable, exhausting lives of various manual laborers and craftsmen, and the comparatively comfortable, respected life of a scribe. While clearly written with persuasive exaggeration intended to motivate young students, the text does offer a genuinely valuable, if biased, window into how different professions were perceived within Egyptian society, and how highly scribal literacy was valued as a path toward stability and respect. And it's easy to understand why literacy carried such weight. In a society where the overwhelming majority of the population could not read or write, a literate scribe held genuine power and opportunity. Scribes were needed everywhere throughout Egyptian administration, recording tax collection, managing granary inventories, documenting legal disputes, drafting official correspondence, recording construction projects, and maintaining the detailed administrative records necessary to run a centralized kingdom stretching along hundreds of miles of the Nile Valley. A skilled scribe could rise through Egyptian society in ways that were simply unavailable to most of the population, potentially advancing into significant administrative positions, working closely with temple officials, provincial governors, or even the royal court itself. This connects directly back to something we touched on earlier, the Egyptian concept of mad, order, truth, and cosmic balance. Scribes and the administrative bureaucracy they staffed were not simply practical tools of governance. They were understood, at least symbolically, as instruments for maintaining mad within human society. Accurate records prevented disputes and injustice. Fair tax assessment, based on careful measurement of flood levels and harvest yields, helped ensure the kingdom's resources were distributed appropriately. Written laws and judicial records helped maintain social order and provided a mechanism for resolving disputes fairly, at least in principle, according to established custom and precedent. Egyptian law, interestingly, does not survive today in the form of a single, comprehensive law code the way we have from certain other ancient civilizations. such as the famous Code of Hammurabi from ancient Mesopotamia. Instead, Egyptian legal practice appears to have relied heavily on established custom, precedent, and the judgment of officials and local courts, guided by the broader principle of ma'at rather than an exhaustive, codified legal system written down in one place. Local councils, sometimes referred to as kenbet, handled disputes and legal matters within communities, with more significant cases potentially escalating to regional or even royal attention. Interestingly, surviving legal records suggest that ordinary Egyptians, including women, could and did bring legal disputes before these courts, seeking resolution over matters like property disputes, inheritance, contested marriages, and theft. This reinforces something we touched on earlier regarding the relatively strong legal standing of Egyptian women compared to many other ancient societies, since court records show women initiating legal action and defending their interests directly, rather than exclusively through a male relative acting on their behalf. Taxation represented another enormous administrative undertaking, closely tied to the agricultural cycle we discussed earlier. Rather than a currency-based tax system in the modern sense, since coined currency didn't become widely used in Egypt until much later, closer to the late period and the arrival of Greek influence, Egyptian taxation for most of its history operated through a system of payment in kind, grain, livestock, and labor, carefully assessed and recorded by scribes based on land holdings, and crucially, the height of that year's Nile flood. Since a lower flood meant a smaller expected harvest, and therefore adjusted tax expectations, this brings us to something worth appreciating fully: the sheer scale of coordinated bureaucracy required to keep a civilization like this functioning smoothly across 3,000 years. Grain needed to be collected, recorded, and stored in state and temple granaries, serving as a critical buffer against years of poor flooding or crop failure. Labor needed to be organized, particularly for major state construction projects like the pyramids and later temple complexes, often coordinated around the agricultural calendar, employing farmers during the months when flooding made fieldwork impossible anyway, an elegant solution that kept the workforce productive year-round rather than idle during the inundation season. Beyond bureaucracy and law, hieroglyphic writing also carried deep religious significance in its own right. The Egyptians themselves believed that hieroglyphs were a divine gift, invented by the god Thoth, and the very act of writing something down, particularly a person's name, was believed to carry genuine magical power, capable of extending that person's existence and memory into eternity. This belief helps explain why Egyptian tombs are so densely covered in inscriptions recording the names, titles, and accomplishments of the deceased. It wasn't simply decoration or record, keeping in the way we might think of it today. Writing a person's name was believed to help ensure their continued existence in the afterlife, and conversely, deliberately erasing someone's name from monuments and inscriptions, something that did occasionally happen to disgraced or politically inconvenient historical figures, was considered a genuinely serious act, potentially threatening that person's very survival in the afterlife by attempting to erase their memory entirely from human record. We'll encounter a particularly striking example of this practice later in our journey, when we discuss a pharaoh whose religious reforms proved so controversial that later generations of Egyptians made a deliberate, sustained effort to remove nearly every trace of his name and existence from Egyptian history, an effort that very nearly succeeded, until modern archaeology gradually pieced his story back together from the fragments that survived. For now, though, Let's step back once more to the broader sweep of Egyptian history, because the Old Kingdom, with all its pyramid building, its administrative sophistication, and its centralized royal authority, could not last forever. Eventually, the very structures of power that had made such extraordinary achievements possible began to strain, and Egypt would enter a period of genuine political fragmentation, before eventually finding its way back toward unity and stability once again. Collapse and recovery. The Middle Kingdom around 2181 BCE, the centralized authority of the Old Kingdom began to unravel. Historians point to several likely contributing factors, though as with much of ancient history, the full picture involves some genuine uncertainty and ongoing scholarly debate. One significant factor appears to have been environmental. Evidence suggests that Egypt experienced a series of unusually low Nile floods during this period, potentially connected to broader climate shifts affecting the region. Given everything we've discussed about how completely Egyptian agriculture, and by extension Egyptian political and economic stability, depended on a reliable, well-behaved flood cycle, even a sustained period of poor flooding could have triggered serious famine, economic strain, and social unrest. At the same time, the long-term growth of regional governors, known as nomarchs, who administered Egypt's various provinces, had gradually accumulated increasing wealth, land, and local power throughout the later Old Kingdom. As central royal authority weakened, likely worsened by the economic strain of poor harvests, these regional leaders increasingly operated with greater independence, and Egypt effectively fragmented into competing regional power centers rather than remaining under strong, unified royal control. This era, known as the First Intermediate Period, lasted roughly from 2181 to 2055 BCE, and it's often described in older historical accounts using fairly dramatic language, sometimes framed almost as a dark age of chaos and suffering. Modern scholarship tends to take a more measured view. While this was certainly a period of genuine political fragmentation, and at least during certain phases, real economic hardship and localized conflict between competing regional rulers, it does not appear to have been a complete collapse of Egyptian civilization or culture. Regional centers continued functioning, art and literature continued to be produced, and in fact, some fascinating and emotionally raw literary works survive from this period, reflecting genuine anxiety and uncertainty about a world where the previously assumed permanence of centralized royal authority and cosmic stability suddenly seemed genuinely fragile. One particularly notable surviving text from this general era, sometimes referred to as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, offers something like an extended lament describing social upheaval, reversed social hierarchies, and general disorder, language that reflects real anxiety about a world where mad itself seemed to have broken down. While historians debate exactly how literally to interpret this text as a direct historical record versus a work of literary and moral reflection, it nonetheless offers a genuinely valuable window into how deeply unsettling this period of fragmentation felt to at least some Egyptians living through it, or reflecting back on it shortly afterward. Eventually, around 2055 BCE, a ruler from Thebes named Mentuhotep II managed to reunify Egypt, defeating rival regional powers and re-establishing centralized royal control, marking the beginning of what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a period generally considered to run from around 2055 to 1650 BCE. The Middle Kingdom is sometimes described by historians as a kind of classical golden age of Egyptian literature and culture, and it's genuinely worth appreciating why. Having just emerged from a period of real uncertainty and fragmentation, Middle Kingdom Egyptian culture seems to have developed a heightened interest in themes of order, justice, personal morality, and the proper relationship between a ruler and his people, perhaps as a direct reflection on the lessons learned from the instability of the preceding era. Some of ancient Egypt's most celebrated literary works date from this period, including sophisticated narrative tales, wisdom literature offering ethical and practical life guidance, and poetry exploring personal, emotional, and philosophical themes with a level of introspective depth that continues to genuinely impress modern readers and scholars. One famous example, the tale of Sinu, tells the story of an Egyptian official who flees Egypt following the death of a king, living for years in exile among foreign peoples in the region of modern-day Syria and Canaan, before eventually being invited to return home in his old age. The story explores themes of identity, homesickness, loyalty, and the deep, almost magnetic pull that Egyptian identity and homeland held even for someone who had built an entirely new life far away. It's a narrative that, remarkably, continues to resonate with modern readers, touching on universal human experiences of displacement and the longing for home that transcend the specific historical and cultural context in which it was originally written. Politically and administratively, Middle Kingdom rulers worked carefully to rebuild and strengthen centralized royal authority, while also, notably, working to bring the power of regional nomarchs back under closer royal control, learning directly from the fragmentation of the preceding era. Middle Kingdom pharaohs also expanded Egyptian influence and trade connections, including military campaigns and fortification building along Egypt's southern border with Nubia, a region rich in valuable resources including gold, and expanded diplomatic and trade relationships with regions to the northeast, including areas of the Levant. Irrigation and land reclamation projects, particularly around a region known as the Fayum, a fertile depression connected to the Nile by a natural channel, were expanded during this period, demonstrating continued Egyptian engineering sophistication in managing water resources to maximize agricultural productivity, beyond simply relying on the natural floodplain alone. Religiously, this period also saw a notable, gradual shift in how ordinary Egyptians related to ideas about death and the afterlife, a topic that deserves genuine attention on its own, and one we'll return to in much greater depth later in this journey. But it's worth briefly noting here that during the Middle Kingdom, funerary texts and practices that had previously been largely restricted to royalty during the Old Kingdom began gradually extending to a wider circle of officials and elite non-royal Egyptians, part of a broader trend historians sometimes describe as the democratization of the afterlife, the increasing sense that the hope of eternal life was not necessarily reserved exclusively for the pharaoh, but potentially available, through proper ritual and moral conduct, to a wider portion of Egyptian society. The Middle Kingdom eventually came to an end through another period of political fragmentation, known as the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1650 to 1550 BCE, during which a group known as the Hyksos, generally understood to be a population of mixed origin with significant roots in the Levant region to Egypt's northeast, gained control over parts of northern Egypt, ruling from a base in the eastern Nile Delta. while native Egyptian rulers retained control over the south from Thebes. The Hyksos period has sometimes been portrayed in older historical narratives, including some ancient Egyptian sources written after their expulsion, in fairly negative terms, as a foreign occupation imposed through violent conquest. Modern archaeological evidence suggests a more complicated picture, indicating gradual settlement and rising political influence by immigrant communities already present in the Delta region for economic and trade reasons, eventually evolving into full political control of northern Egypt, rather than necessarily a single, sudden violent invasion. Regardless of the precise mechanics of how it came about, the presence of the Hyksos as rulers of part of Egyptian territory represented a genuinely significant disruption to Egyptian ideas about unified, native royal authority, and its eventual resolution would set the stage for one of the most powerful and expansive periods in all of Egyptian history. It's time to talk about the New Kingdom, the Age of Empire, when Egypt would grow wealthier, more powerful, and more far-reaching than at any previous point in its long history. The New Kingdom and the Age of Empire around 1550 BCE, an Egyptian ruler named Ahmose I, working from the traditional southern power base of Thebes, successfully drove the Hyksos rulers out of the Nile Delta, reunifying Egypt under native rule once again, and establishing what historians call the New Kingdom, a period that would last until roughly 1070 BCE and represent, in many respects, the height of ancient Egyptian wealth, military power, and international influence. This period produced some of the most famous names in all of Egyptian history, and it's worth slowing down to spend real time with several of them, not simply as a list of achievements, but as genuine historical figures who lived, ruled, and faced real pressures within a specific, tangible world. Let's begin with Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut initially served as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, following the death of her husband, Thutmose II. Rather than stepping back once her stepson came of age, Hatshepsut instead assumed the full formal title and authority of Pharaoh herself, ruling as a female king, a position most typically reserved for men, for roughly 2 decades, from around 1479 to 1458 BCE. What makes Hatshepsut's reign genuinely fascinating is not simply that a woman ruled as pharaoh, since Egypt had, in rare instances, seen female rulers before her, but how deliberately and carefully she worked to legitimize and reinforce her authority within a strongly male-dominated understanding of kingship. Egyptian royal art and statuary from her reign sometimes depict her with the traditional false beard associated with pharaonic authority, and with certain masculine physical characteristics blended into otherwise clearly feminine portrayals, suggesting a careful, deliberate visual strategy designed to align her image with established, comfortable expectations of what a legitimate pharaoh should look like, without entirely erasing her identity as a woman. Hatshepsut's reign is particularly remembered for extensive building projects, most famously her stunning mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, near Thebes, an architecturally striking structure built into the cliffs, featuring a series of terraces connected by ramps that remains, even today, considered one of the most beautiful examples of Egyptian architecture. Her reign was also marked by an extraordinary trading expedition to a distant land the Egyptians called Punt, likely located somewhere along the coast of modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or Ethiopia. though its exact location remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. This expedition returned with valuable goods including myrrh trees, exotic animals, gold, and ebony, and the journey was proudly commemorated in detailed relief carvings at her mortuary temple, depicting the expedition's ships, the exotic goods brought back, and even individual portraits of foreign leaders encountered along the way, offering us a genuinely rare glimpse of how Egyptians visually documented contact with distant, unfamiliar cultures. Following Hatshepsut's death, her stepson Thutmose III finally assumed full, sole control of Egypt, and he would go on to become perhaps the greatest military leader in all of Egyptian history, sometimes referred to by modern historians somewhat dramatically as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, a title that, while anachronistic, does capture something of his reputation for extensive, successful military campaigning. Over the course of his reign, Thutmose III led numerous military campaigns into the Levant region, expanding Egyptian influence and control over a wide network of vassal states and tributary territories stretching from Nubia in the south to parts of modern-day Syria in the north. One particularly well-documented early campaign, the Battle of Megiddo, fought around 1457 BCE against a coalition of rebellious Canaanite forces, is actually one of the earliest battles in human history for which we have a genuinely detailed strategic account, recorded by Egyptian scribes who accompanied the military campaign. According to this account, Thutmose personally advocated for a risky but ultimately successful strategy, leading his forces through a narrow, dangerous mountain pass that his own war council had initially argued against, judging it too dangerous, in favor of safer alternative routes. Thutmose's gamble paid off, catching the opposing coalition forces by surprise and resulting in a decisive Egyptian victory. Whether every detail of this account should be taken as objective historical fact, given that it comes from Egyptian royal records naturally inclined to celebrate the pharaoh's wisdom and courage, is a fair question historians continue to weigh carefully, but the broader outline of the campaign and its outcome is well supported by the historical record. Through campaigns like this, repeated over the course of decades, Thutmose III built what many historians describe as Egypt's first true empire, extending far beyond Egypt's traditional borders and establishing a network of economic and political influence that brought enormous wealth flowing back into Egypt itself, through tribute, trade, and captured resources. This wealth transformed Egyptian society in genuinely visible ways. Temple complexes, particularly the Temple of Amun at Karnak, grew to enormous scale during this period, funded substantially by the flow of resources generated through New Kingdom military success and international trade. The Temple of Karnak, in fact, continued to be expanded by successive pharaohs over literally centuries, eventually growing into one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed anywhere in the ancient world, filled with massive stone columns, obelisks, and inscriptions celebrating successive generations of Egyptian military and religious achievement. It's worth pausing here to imagine what daily life might have looked like for an ordinary Egyptian during this particular period of expanding wealth and international connection. Trade networks brought genuinely new and exotic goods into Egyptian markets, foreign woods, incense, unusual animals, and luxury items from distant lands that previous generations of Egyptians might never have encountered. Egyptian art from this period increasingly reflects awareness of foreign peoples, foreign fashions, and foreign luxury goods, suggesting a society that was, for this particular chapter of its long history, unusually cosmopolitan and internationally connected compared to earlier, more insular periods of Egyptian civilization. At the same time, this era of military expansion also meant that a meaningful portion of Egyptian society, at least among certain classes, would have had direct or indirect experience with warfare, whether through military service themselves, family members serving in campaigns, or simply living within a society whose wealth and prestige were now closely tied to continued military and diplomatic success abroad. Soldiers who served loyally and successfully could be rewarded with land grants and captured wealth, offering another genuine avenue of social mobility beyond the scribal path we discussed earlier, though obviously carrying very real risks of injury or death that farming or scribal work generally did not involve to the same degree. The New Kingdom, at this stage in its history, represented Egypt at what was arguably the peak of its wealth, military power, and international prestige. But this era of confident expansion and traditional religious practice was about to be dramatically, unexpectedly disrupted by a pharaoh whose religious convictions would lead him to attempt something no Egyptian ruler before or after him ever fully attempted: a radical reimagining of Egyptian religion itself, centered entirely around a single god. It's time to talk about Akhenaten. Akhenaten and the sun that changed everything sometime around 1353 BCE. A pharaoh came to the throne under the name Amenhotep IV, a name that itself honored the god Amen, reflecting the traditional religious framework of his royal predecessors. But within just a few years of his reign, this same king would do something almost unimaginable within the deeply established religious traditions of Egyptian civilization. He would change his own name, abandon the traditional Egyptian pantheon in practice, and attempt to reshape Egyptian religious life around the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the visible disk of the sun itself. He renamed himself Akhenaten, a name generally understood to mean something like effective for the Aten, or one who is beneficial to the Aten. And he pursued this religious transformation with an intensity that appears to have gone well beyond simple personal preference for one particular deity among many. Traditional Egyptian religious practice, as we've discussed at length already, was built around a rich, layered pantheon of many gods, each associated with different aspects of existence, worshipped through different institutions, festivals, and traditions built up over well more than 1,000 years of Egyptian history by this point. Akhenaten's religious reforms sought to dramatically simplify, and in the eyes of many historians, effectively centralize, this entire religious landscape around devotion to the Aten alone. This is genuinely one of the most striking and debated episodes in ancient religious history. Some historians and scholars have described Akhenaten's reforms as representing an early, or at least strikingly early, form of monotheism, the worship of a single god to the exclusion of others, a concept that would not become widespread in the broader ancient world for many centuries afterward. Other historians urge more caution with this framing, noting that Akhenaten's reforms may be better understood as an extreme form of henotheism, the elevation of one god to overwhelming primary importance without necessarily denying the theoretical existence of other deities altogether, and pointing out that we should be careful about projecting later religious concepts backward onto a genuinely unique, and in many ways, still not fully understood historical episode. What we can say with more confidence is that the practical impact of Akhenaten's reforms was dramatic and deeply disruptive to established Egyptian religious and social life. Traditional temples, particularly the enormously wealthy and influential Temple of Amun at Thebes that we discussed in the previous chapter, saw their funding, staffing, and religious authority significantly diminished. Akhenaten went so far as to order the names and images of Amun, and in some cases other traditional gods, to be physically chiseled out from monuments and inscriptions throughout Egypt, an act of genuinely aggressive religious erasure that would have been almost unthinkable within traditional Egyptian religious practice up to this point. Perhaps most dramatically, Akhenaten relocated Egypt's capital entirely, away from the traditional religious and political centers of Thebes and Memphis, to a newly constructed city built essentially from nothing, on a stretch of previously undeveloped land roughly halfway between the two, a city he named Akhenaten, meaning Horizon of the Aten, known today by its modern Arabic name, Amarna. This new capital was built rapidly, seemingly intended as a genuinely fresh religious and political start, entirely free from the accumulated traditions, priesthoods, and physical monuments associated with Egypt's older gods. Art from this period, often referred to by modern scholars as the Amarna period, also shows a genuinely striking and unusual stylistic shift compared to the more idealized, formal artistic conventions of earlier Egyptian art. Akhenaten himself is frequently depicted with unusually elongated features, a distinctive body shape, and in some cases together with his family in surprisingly intimate, informal scenes, showing him affectionately embracing his wife and playing with his young daughters, a level of tender, personal domesticity almost never depicted so openly in earlier or later royal Egyptian art. Historians continue to debate exactly how literally to interpret these unusual artistic conventions, whether they reflect genuine physical characteristics, deliberate religious symbolism connecting the royal family to particular concepts of fertility and creation associated with the Aten, or some combination of artistic and ideological factors we don't yet fully understand. Akhenaten's principal wife, Nefertiti, remains one of the most recognizable figures from all of ancient Egypt, largely due to a stunning painted limestone bust discovered in 1912 at Amarna, now housed in Berlin, depicting her with an elegant, strikingly beautiful, and remarkably well-preserved appearance. Beyond her famous image, however, genuine historical evidence about Nefertiti's specific role and activities remains somewhat limited and continues to be actively researched and debated by Egyptologists, including intriguing but not fully settled questions about whether she may have held unusually significant religious and political authority during Akhenaten's reign, possibly even ruling independently for a period, either alongside her husband or following his death. Under a different royal name that scholars are still working to conclusively identify, it's worth pausing to imagine what ordinary life might have felt like for typical Egyptians during this genuinely unusual period. For priests and officials connected to the traditional temple institutions that had lost funding, prestige, and purpose, this must have represented a genuinely disorienting and threatening disruption to established careers and ways of life built up over generations. For ordinary farmers and craftsmen, the impact of these high-level religious reforms is harder to assess with confidence, though the relocation of the capital itself would have required significant labor and resources, and the disruption to traditional temple institutions, which, as we discussed earlier, controlled substantial agricultural land, employment, and economic activity, likely had genuine ripple effects reaching well beyond the royal court and priesthood alone. Akhenaten's religious revolution, however, did not survive him. Following his death, around 1336 BCE, Egyptian religious and political authorities began a gradual, and eventually quite thorough, process of reversing his reforms. The traditional pantheon, and particularly the worship of Amun, was restored to its previous position of prominence. The capital was eventually moved back to traditional centers. And in the decades and generations that followed, later Egyptian rulers undertook a deliberate, sustained campaign to erase Akhenaten's name and memory from Egyptian historical record, referring to him in later inscriptions, when they referred to him at all, simply as the enemy or that criminal, without using his actual name, reflecting the genuinely serious way that damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of someone's memory, was understood within Egyptian religious belief. Since, as we discussed earlier, the survival of one's name was believed to carry real significance for continued existence in the afterlife, this erasure was remarkably effective, at least for a very long time. Akhenaten's name and reign remained essentially unknown to the world for well over 3,000 years, only gradually reconstructed by modern archaeologists and historians beginning in the 19th and 20th centuries, piecing together his story from the physical evidence that survived despite this deliberate ancient effort at erasure. The ruins of Amarna itself, surviving artistic and religious texts hidden or overlooked by those originally tasked with destroying them, and eventually, most famously, evidence connected to the brief reign of his own son and successor, because it was this son, a young boy who came to the throne following the chaotic aftermath of his father's religious revolution, who would eventually become, quite unexpectedly, the single most famous name in all of ancient Egyptian history, not because of anything remarkable he personally accomplished during his short reign, but because of an extraordinary stroke of archaeological fortune nearly 3,300 years later. It's time to talk about Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun and the return to the old gods. Tutankhamun came to the Egyptian throne around 1332 BCE, when he was likely somewhere around 9 or 10 years old, and he died roughly 9 or 10 years later, still a very young man, probably around 19 years old, based on skeletal analysis of his remains. In terms of pure historical accomplishment during his lifetime, Tutankhamun's actual reign was, by most measures, relatively unremarkable compared to towering figures like Thutmose III or later rulers we'll discuss shortly. Given that he came to the throne as a young child, real political and administrative power during at least the early years of his reign was almost certainly held primarily by senior advisors and officials acting in his name, most notably a figure named I, who would himself later briefly become pharaoh following Tutankhamun's death. What we can say with confidence is that Tutankhamun's reign oversaw the formal restoration of traditional Egyptian religion following his father Akhenaten's dramatic religious upheaval. His original birth name was actually Tutankhaten, directly honoring the Aten in the manner his father had insisted upon, but this was changed to Tutankhamun, honoring the restored primacy of the god Amun, a clear and deliberate public signal that Egypt was formally returning to its traditional religious framework. Official inscriptions from his reign explicitly describe the restoration of neglected temples, the reinstatement of traditional priesthoods, and a broader effort to repair the religious and administrative disruption caused by his father's reforms. So why, Given this relatively modest historical record, did Tutankhamun become perhaps the single most famous name associated with all of ancient Egypt among people today? The answer lies almost entirely in what happened not during his lifetime, but in November of 1922 CE, nearly 3,300 years after his death, when British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by his patron Lord Carnarvon, discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, remarkably still largely intact, having somehow escaped the extensive tomb robbing that had affected the vast majority of other royal Egyptian burials over the intervening millennia. It's worth pausing to genuinely appreciate what an extraordinary discovery this was, and why it captured global public imagination so completely at the time, and honestly, continues to do so today. Nearly every other pharaoh's tomb from the Valley of the Kings had been discovered, at some point over the preceding centuries, already looted, sometimes in antiquity itself, sometimes by later tomb robbers working in the centuries and millennia that followed. Tutankhamun's tomb, likely at least partially because his reign was relatively brief and politically unremarkable, and his tomb correspondingly smaller and less prominently located than tombs built for more famous, longer-reigning pharaohs, had somehow been largely overlooked, its location eventually buried and hidden beneath debris from later construction work in the Valley of the Kings. When Carter finally broke through into the tomb's antechamber and, in a now legendary account, held up a candle to peer through a small opening while his patron Carnarvon anxiously asked what he could see, Carter is famously reported to have replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Whatever the precise accuracy of this often quoted exchange, the tomb's contents genuinely were extraordinary. Thousands of individual objects, golden shrines, elaborate furniture, chariots, weapons, jewelry, statues, and of course, most famously, the young king's iconic solid gold death mask, along with his mummified remains encased within a series of nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold. This discovery offered historians and the general public alike an unprecedented, remarkably vivid window into the material wealth, craftsmanship, and religious beliefs surrounding royal burial practice during the New Kingdom, all preserved essentially undisturbed since the moment the tomb was originally sealed. And importantly, Tutankhamun's tomb, despite his own relatively minor historical importance during his actual lifetime, likely represents a genuinely modest example of what a full pharaoh's burial might have included, since more prominent, longer-reigning pharaohs would presumably have been buried with even greater wealth and grandeur, almost all of which has been lost to us forever through ancient and more recent tomb robbing. The story of Tutankhamun's death itself has generated considerable historical curiosity and scholarly debate over the decades since his tomb's discovery. Modern forensic and genetic analysis of his mummified remains has revealed evidence of several health issues during his short life, including a badly broken leg that appears to have occurred shortly before his death, along with evidence of malaria infection. Current scholarly consensus generally leans toward a combination of these factors: a serious injury combined with infection, possibly malaria, as the most likely cause of his relatively early death, rather than more dramatic theories of assassination or murder that captured public imagination in earlier decades, though it's worth acknowledging that some genuine uncertainty remains, since we are working with evidence from remains that are, after all, more than 3,000 years old. Genetic testing has also helped clarify Tutankhamun's family relationships, confirming that his parents were closely related, quite likely siblings, a practice that, as we discussed earlier, does appear among certain periods of Egyptian royal lineage, intended to preserve dynastic purity, but one that may well have contributed to some of the health issues evident in his remains, since close genetic relation between parents is associated with increased risk of various congenital health conditions. Following Tutankhamun's death without a surviving direct heir, his elderly advisor briefly assumed the throne, followed shortly afterward by a military commander named Horemheb, who worked to further consolidate the restoration of traditional religious and administrative order following the disruptions of the Amarna period, effectively closing out this particular unusual chapter of Egyptian religious history and setting the stage for the rise of a powerful new royal family, one that would produce perhaps the single most famous and long-reigning pharaoh in all of Egyptian history. It's time to talk about Ramesses the Great. Ramesses the Great and the Twilight of Empire. Ramesses II, sometimes called Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for an extraordinary 66 years, from around 1279 to 1213 BCE, and by the time of his death, he had lived long enough to outlive several of his own designated heirs, ultimately being succeeded by his 13th son, Merneptah, since so many of his earlier sons had already died of natural causes during his own remarkably long lifetime. Few Egyptian pharaohs worked as deliberately and effectively as Ramesses II to shape and promote their own historical legacy, both during their own lifetime and for future generations. He commissioned an extraordinary volume of construction projects throughout Egypt and Nubia, including massive additions to the temple complex at Karnak, his own enormous mortuary temple known as the Ramesseum, and perhaps most famously, the spectacular rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel in southern Egypt, featuring 4 colossal seated statues of Ramesses himself, each towering 65 feet tall, carved directly into a mountainside, an unmistakable, permanent declaration of royal power and divine favor, positioned strategically near Egypt's southern border with Nubia. Early in his reign, in 1274 BCE, Ramesses led Egyptian forces into one of the most significant and well-documented military engagements in all of ancient history, the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire, a major rival power based in what is now Turkey, over control of contested territory in the region of modern-day Syria. The battle itself appears to have been a genuinely close, chaotic engagement, with Ramesses's forces initially caught in a dangerous ambush after being misled by captured Hittite spies about the location of the main enemy army, before Egyptian reinforcements arrived in time to prevent what could have been a catastrophic defeat. What happened next tells us something genuinely fascinating about how ancient rulers managed their public image. Despite the battle appearing, based on the available evidence, to have ended in something closer to a strategic draw, with neither side achieving a decisive, clear victory, Ramesses had the engagement extensively commemorated throughout Egyptian monuments as a triumphant personal victory, complete with dramatic depictions of himself single-handedly turning the tide of battle through his own courage and the direct favor of the gods. It's a vivid reminder that ancient historical records, particularly those commissioned directly by rulers celebrating their own achievements, need to be read with an appropriately critical eye, understanding that Egyptian pharaohs, like political leaders throughout history, were not above shaping the historical record to serve their own reputation and legacy. Remarkably, the eventual resolution of the broader conflict between Egypt and the Hittite Empire produced one of the earliest and most well-documented peace treaties in recorded human history, signed around 1259 BCE between Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hatshepsut III. Copies of this treaty have survived in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions, allowing historians a genuinely rare opportunity to compare how the same historical agreement was recorded and framed by two different ancient civilizations. The treaty established mutual peace, a form of non-aggression pact, and even provisions for mutual defense against outside threats and the extradition of fugitives between the two kingdoms, demonstrating a level of sophisticated formal diplomacy between major ancient powers that continues to impress historians today. Beyond his military and diplomatic activities, Ramesses's extraordinarily long reign also brought genuine, sustained economic prosperity and monumental building activity to Egypt, and his reign is often considered to represent something close to the final true peak of New Kingdom power and wealth before Egypt's slow, gradual decline as a dominant regional power over the following centuries. It's worth pausing here to reflect on ordinary daily life during this particular era, since Ramesses's reign happens to coincide with some of our very best surviving evidence about the actual lived experience of ordinary Egyptian workers, thanks to a remarkable village that has provided historians with an unusually detailed, intimate window into daily working-class Egyptian life. This village, known today as Deir el-Medina, was home to the specialized craftsmen and artisans responsible for constructing and decorating the royal tombs in the nearby Valley of the Kings, and it has proven to be one of the single richest archaeological sites for understanding ordinary Egyptian daily life anywhere in the historical record. Because these workers were skilled, literate craftsmen employed directly by the state, they left behind an extraordinary volume of everyday written records, not grand royal inscriptions but genuinely ordinary personal documents, notes about work schedules and absences, records of disputes between neighbors, love poetry, marriage contracts, letters between family members. Even court records documenting what appears to be one of the earliest documented labor strikes in recorded human history, occurring later during the reign of Ramesses III, when workers, frustrated by delayed food rations, organized a coordinated work stoppage and sit-in protest, demanding their promised payment, an extraordinary, deeply human echo across more than 3,000 years of history. Let's imagine, for a moment, an ordinary evening in Deir el-Medina during Ramesses's reign. A skilled painter, having spent his working days assigned to a rotating shift schedule, likely 8 days of work followed by 2 days of rest, returns home after decorating another section of a royal tomb deep in the nearby valley, his hands still faintly stained with pigment. His wife has been managing the household in his absence, perhaps also engaged in her own weaving or trading activities within the tight-knit village community. Their children, like children everywhere, have spent the day playing among the narrow streets between mudbrick homes, perhaps occasionally getting into exactly the kind of minor trouble that shows up, delightfully, in some of the more casual surviving records and messages between villagers. This village gives us something genuinely precious, confirmation, in vivid, granular detail, of many of the broader patterns of daily Egyptian life we've discussed throughout this journey: family structure, work rhythms, personal relationships, religious devotion, and occasional interpersonal conflict, not reconstructed from royal inscriptions or idealized artistic depictions, but drawn directly from the actual, casual, sometimes gossipy, written records of ordinary working Egyptians going about their genuinely ordinary lives. But even as Ramesses's long reign represented a genuine high point of new kingdom stability and prosperity, forces were already gathering, both within Egypt and beyond its borders, that would gradually erode this stability over the following century and beyond. Following Ramesses's death, and particularly during and after the reign of Ramesses III, who successfully defended Egypt against a serious invasion by a mysterious coalition of seafaring raiders known to history as the Sea Peoples, Egypt's position as the dominant regional superpower began a long, gradual decline that would eventually transform the kingdom's place in the broader ancient world entirely. It's time to follow that slow decline and see where it eventually led. Death, mummification, and the journey to the afterlife. Throughout this journey, we've touched several times on how deeply Egyptian religious belief was tied to ideas about death and the afterlife. And it's worth now spending real, focused time on this subject directly, because few aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization have captured modern imagination quite as powerfully, and few reveal quite as much about how Egyptians actually understood the nature of existence itself. For the Egyptians, death was not understood as a final ending, but as a genuinely dangerous, complex transition into a continued form of existence, provided that certain crucial conditions were properly met. This belief shaped an enormous amount of Egyptian religious practice, artistic production, and even everyday behavior, since living a morally sound life and ensuring proper burial preparations were both considered essential to securing a successful passage into the afterlife. Central to this belief was the idea that a person consisted of several distinct spiritual components, beyond simply the physical body. There was the Ka, a kind of life force or spiritual double that came into existence alongside a person at birth and required sustenance. Hence the food offerings we discussed earlier, even after death. There was the Ba, often visually represented as a human-headed bird, which could be understood as something closer to a person's individual personality or character, capable of traveling between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And there was the Ak, representing a fully transfigured affective spirit, the state a person hoped to successfully achieve after death, having successfully completed the dangerous journey through the underworld and passed the necessary judgment that awaited every soul. This journey and judgment process is described in remarkable, vivid detail in various Egyptian funerary texts, most famously in what we commonly call the Book of the Dead, though this modern title is actually somewhat misleading, since the original Egyptian title translates more closely to something like spells for coming forth by day. And it wasn't a single fixed book in the way we might think of a religious scripture, but rather a body of spells, prayers, and instructions that individuals or their families could select from and have copied onto papyrus, tailored to their particular needs and resources, intended to guide and protect the deceased through the dangers of the underworld. Perhaps the single most famous element of this journey is the weighing of the heart ceremony. According to Egyptian belief, upon death, a person's heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence, emotion, and moral character, rather than the brain, which Egyptians appear to have considered relatively unimportant, was brought before the god Osiris and a tribunal of divine judges in the Hall of Two Truths. There, the heart would be placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Mad, representing truth and cosmic order. Before this weighing took place, the deceased was expected to recite what scholars often call the negative confession, a lengthy declaration listing dozens of specific wrongs the person claimed not to have committed during their lifetime, ranging from serious moral offenses like murder and theft to more surprisingly mundane transgressions like being habitually angry without just cause or being deaf to words of truth. It's a genuinely fascinating document, offering us real insight into Egyptian ethical values, since the sins explicitly listed reveal exactly what Egyptian society considered morally important: honesty, fairness, kindness toward others, respect for property, and general good conduct within the community. If the heart balanced evenly against the feather of man, demonstrating that the person had lived a life reasonably aligned with truth and moral order, they were declared justified and permitted to continue onward into a blessed afterlife, often imagined as a kind of idealized reflection of earthly life, a peaceful land of eternal abundance, sometimes called the Field of Reeds, where the deceased could continue farming, socializing, and enjoying life free from illness, hardship, or death, essentially getting to relive the good parts of earthly existence forever. But if the heart proved too heavy, weighed down by wrongdoing and moral failure, it would be devoured by a fearsome composite creature called Ammit, often depicted with the head of a crocodile, the front body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, representing a kind of ultimate spiritual destruction, not eternal punishment or torment in the way some other religious traditions imagine an afterlife of suffering, but rather complete annihilation, the end of the person's existence entirely. Arguably an even more frightening prospect within the Egyptian worldview, where mere existence itself, in some meaningful continued form, was considered the fundamental prerequisite for anything resembling a positive afterlife outcome at all. Given the enormous stakes involved in this belief system, it becomes much easier to understand why Egyptians invested such extraordinary effort, resources, and ritual precision into properly preparing a body for burial, since the physical preservation of the body was considered genuinely important to a person's continued existence and spiritual well-being after death. This brings us to mummification itself, a process that Egyptian embalmers refined and perfected over many centuries of practice. The full mummification process, at least for those wealthy enough to afford the most elaborate treatment, typically took around 70 days to complete, and it involved several distinct stages. First, internal organs that were considered likely to decay rapidly and cause damage to the body, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, were carefully removed. Interestingly, the heart, given its believed importance as the seat of intelligence and moral character necessary for the judgment we just described, was deliberately left in place within the body. The brain, by contrast, was typically removed and discarded, often through the nostril using a specialized hooked instrument, since Egyptians apparently placed little spiritual or practical importance on preserving it, an intriguing detail that reveals just how differently ancient Egyptian understanding of human anatomy and identity functioned compared to how we think about it today. The removed organs, with the exception of the discarded brain, were themselves individually preserved and typically stored in a set of 4 containers known as canopic jars, each traditionally associated with one of 4 minor protective deities known as the 4 sons of Horus, and each jar lid often carved to represent the specific protective deity associated with that particular organ: a human head, a baboon head, a jackal head, and a falcon head, respectively. Following the removal of these organs, the body itself was carefully dried out using large quantities of a naturally occurring salt compound called natron, which we briefly mentioned earlier in a very different, more mundane context as a cleaning agent. This drying process, essential to preventing bodily decay, took the majority of the 70-day preparation period, roughly 40 days on its own, as the body was packed both internally and externally with natron to thoroughly draw out moisture. Once sufficiently dried, the body would be cleaned, sometimes treated with various oils and resins to help preserve the skin and restore some degree of lifelike appearance, and then carefully wrapped in many layers of linen bandages, a meticulous process that could itself take another 2 weeks or more, with priests reciting specific protective spells and prayers throughout the wrapping process, and protective amulets frequently placed between individual layers of wrapping at specific points on the body, believed to offer magical protection during the dangerous journey through the underworld that awaited the deceased. For the wealthiest and most prominent Egyptians, particularly royalty, this wrapped mummy would then be placed within an elaborately decorated coffin, sometimes a series of nested coffins, one fitted within another, before finally being placed within the tomb itself, surrounded by all the provisions, furniture, food offerings, and personal possessions considered necessary to sustain the person comfortably throughout their eternal afterlife existence. It's worth acknowledging honestly that this full, elaborate 70-day mummification process, along with an impressively decorated tomb, represented an enormous expense that was simply beyond the means of the vast majority of ordinary Egyptians. Most ordinary Egyptians received significantly simpler burial treatment, sometimes involving more basic preservation methods, simpler wrapping, and considerably more modest grave goods, reflecting their more limited household resources, though even relatively modest burials generally still attempted to include at least some basic elements of the broader religious framework we've described, appropriate protective amulets, and whatever provisions a family could reasonably manage to include, reflecting how genuinely important these beliefs were across essentially every level of Egyptian society, not merely among the wealthy elite. There's something worth sitting with quietly here as we bring this particular chapter to a close. For all the popular fascination that mummies and elaborate tomb treasures understandably generate, at the very heart of this entire elaborate system was something profoundly human and genuinely relatable, a deep, sincere hope that death was not truly the end, that the people we love and the lives we build might somehow continue, in some meaningful form, beyond the boundary of our final breath. The specific rituals, the natron and linen wrappings, the canopic jars and protective spells, might feel distant and unfamiliar to us today. But the underlying hope driving all of it, that love and identity and existence itself might somehow persist beyond death, is something that connects us to these people across more than 3,000 years of accumulated human history, in a way that feels genuinely close, rather than distant at all. The slow decline and the age of foreign rule following the death of Ramesses III, sometime around 1155 BCE, Egypt entered a period of gradual, sustained decline in its position as the dominant power of the ancient Near East, a process that unfolded over centuries rather than through any single, sudden collapse. Several interconnected factors appear to have contributed to this long decline. The broader Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world experienced significant upheaval during this general period, sometimes referred to by historians as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a genuinely fascinating and still not entirely understood episode during which several major ancient civilizations and trading networks throughout the region experienced serious disruption, within a relatively compressed period of time, roughly across the 12th century BCE. The mysterious sea peoples we mentioned briefly earlier, whose exact origins and identity remain a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation and debate, appear to have played some role in this broader regional disruption. And while Egypt itself, under Ramesses III, successfully repelled a serious invasion attempt, the broader trading networks and diplomatic relationships that had helped fuel Egyptian New Kingdom prosperity were seriously disrupted throughout this turbulent period. Internally, Egypt also faced growing challenges. The enormous wealth and political influence accumulated by the priesthood of Amen at Thebes, which we discussed earlier, continued to grow throughout this period, to the point where the high priests of Amen effectively governed Upper Egypt as an increasingly independent power center, existing somewhat uneasily alongside the official Pharaohs' authority, which was increasingly centered further north. This growing division between religious and political authority created ongoing internal tension that further weakened effective centralized governance. By around 1070 BCE, this internal division had become significant enough that historians mark the beginning of what's called the Third Intermediate Period, a lengthy and genuinely complex era, lasting until around 664 BCE, during which Egypt experienced fragmented rule, competing dynasties, and at various points, rule by rulers of foreign origin, including a notable period during which a dynasty of Nubian kings, from the kingdom of Kush to Egypt's south, actually conquered and ruled over Egypt itself, in what's sometimes called the 25th dynasty, ruling from around 744 to 656 BCE. This period of Nubian rule over Egypt deserves genuine attention in its own right, since it's sometimes overlooked in popular accounts of Egyptian history, despite representing a fascinating and historically significant chapter. The Kushite pharaohs of this dynasty, including notable rulers like Pe and Taharka, presented themselves explicitly as restorers and preservers of traditional Egyptian religious and cultural practice, having themselves been deeply influenced by Egyptian civilization for centuries as neighbors, and at times, subject territory to Egyptian power during earlier periods. Under Kushite rule, extensive temple building and restoration projects were undertaken throughout Egypt, and these rulers appear to have genuinely seen themselves as legitimate custodians of authentic Egyptian religious and royal tradition, at a time when they viewed native Egyptian rule as having fallen into fragmented disorder. This Kushite dynasty was eventually pushed out of Egypt following military conflict with the expanding Assyrian Empire, one of the great military powers of the ancient Near East during this period, based in what is now northern Iraq. Assyrian forces invaded Egypt on several occasions during the 7th century BCE, and while direct Assyrian control over Egypt proved relatively brief and difficult to maintain from such a significant distance, this period marks a genuinely important historical turning point, since it represents Egypt's first serious experience of conquest and significant political domination by a major foreign imperial power originating from outside the immediate region, a pattern that, unfortunately for Egyptian independence, would repeat itself with increasing frequency over the following centuries. Following the eventual withdrawal of direct Assyrian control, a native Egyptian dynasty, known as the 26th dynasty, based in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, managed to re-establish independent Egyptian rule beginning around 664 BCE, ushering in a period sometimes called the Late Period, which saw a genuine, deliberate revival of traditional Egyptian art, religious practice, and cultural confidence, sometimes referred to by historians as an archaizing movement. Since Egyptian artists and religious authorities during this period deliberately looked backward, drawing inspiration from the artistic and religious conventions of much earlier periods of Egyptian history, particularly the Old Kingdom, in a conscious effort to reconnect with what they understood as authentic, traditional Egyptian identity, following the disruptions of the preceding centuries. This period of restored native Egyptian independence, however, would not last permanently. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire, under King Cambyses II, successfully conquered Egypt, incorporating it as a province within the enormous Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the largest empires the ancient world had yet seen, stretching from Egypt in the west all the way to the borders of India in the east. Egyptian rule under Persian control alternated between periods of relatively stable, tolerant governance and periods of significant local resentment and occasional rebellion, including a period of roughly 60 years, from 404 to 343 BCE, during which Egypt actually managed to successfully reassert independent native rule once again, before Persian forces eventually reconquered the territory. This second period of Persian control over Egypt would prove considerably shorter-lived than the first, because a genuinely momentous historical development was unfolding elsewhere in the ancient world, one that would soon sweep across Egypt and permanently transform its political trajectory for the remainder of its ancient history. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king who had already begun his extraordinary campaign of conquest against the Persian Empire, arrived in Egypt. Rather than facing serious resistance, Alexander was reportedly welcomed by the Egyptian population as a liberator from unpopular Persian rule, and Egyptian priests formally recognized him as pharaoh, incorporating him into the traditional religious and political framework of Egyptian kingship, much as countless native Egyptian rulers had been recognized before him. During his relatively brief time in Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria along the Mediterranean coast, a city that would go on to become one of the most important and influential cultural, intellectual, and commercial centers in the entire ancient world for centuries afterward, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, which for a time represented perhaps the single greatest concentration of accumulated human knowledge and scholarship anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his surviving generals, and Egypt fell under the control of one of these generals, a man named Ptolemy, who established what would become the final ruling dynasty of ancient Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would govern Egypt for roughly the next 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic period represents a genuinely distinctive final chapter in ancient Egyptian civilization, one where Greek and traditional Egyptian culture existed alongside each other in a complex, sometimes uneasy blend. The Ptolemaic rulers, despite being of Greek Macedonian origin rather than native Egyptian descent, generally worked to present themselves as legitimate pharaohs within the traditional Egyptian religious and cultural framework, commissioning traditional Egyptian-style temples and religious monuments, while simultaneously maintaining a distinctly separate Greek cultural and administrative identity, particularly concentrated in the newly prominent city of Alexandria, which functioned as a genuinely cosmopolitan center of Greek learning, philosophy, science, and literature, existing in some ways as its own distinct cultural world, somewhat apart from the more traditional Egyptian culture continuing along the rest of the Nile Valley. Notably, the Ptolemaic rulers, unlike most native Egyptian pharaohs throughout the preceding 3,000 years, largely continued speaking Greek rather than the Egyptian language, and it was only with the very last ruler of this dynasty, one of history's most famous and endlessly fascinating figures, that this pattern would finally, notably change. It's time, at last, to talk about Cleopatra. Cleopatra and the end of the pharaohs, Cleopatra VII, who came to the Egyptian throne in 51 BCE at around 18 years old, ruling jointly at first with her younger brother in accordance with Ptolemaic tradition, remains, even today, one of the most recognizable names from the entire ancient world. And yet, as is often the case with historical figures who achieve this level of lasting fame, the popular image of Cleopatra that most people carry, often shaped considerably more by later Roman propaganda, and much later still by Renaissance and Hollywood dramatization, differs in genuinely important ways from what historical evidence actually tells us about her. Cleopatra was, by most surviving accounts, a genuinely remarkable and capable ruler. She was reportedly fluent in multiple languages, and significantly, she was apparently the very first ruler in the entire nearly 3-century-long Ptolemaic dynasty to actually learn and speak the Egyptian language, a detail that suggests genuine, deliberate effort to connect meaningfully with her Egyptian subjects, rather than governing at a comfortable, detached distance, the way most of her Greek-speaking predecessors had generally done. She was also, by most historical accounts, highly intelligent and politically astute, actively involved in governance and diplomacy, rather than functioning merely as a passive figurehead. Her reign, however, unfolded during a genuinely precarious period, both for Egypt specifically and for the wider Mediterranean world more broadly, as the Roman Republic, already the dominant military and political power throughout the Mediterranean region, was itself undergoing serious internal political upheaval, competing power struggles that would eventually transform it from a republic into an empire. Egypt, though formally still independent under Ptolemaic rule, existed increasingly within Rome's political and military shadow, its continued independence genuinely dependent on navigating Roman political favor carefully. Cleopatra's political and personal relationships with two of the most powerful Roman leaders of this era, first Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, have understandably captured enormous popular fascination and dramatic retelling across the centuries since. With Julius Caesar, whom she met in 48 BCE during a period of Roman civil war and internal Egyptian political conflict with her brother, Cleopatra formed both a political alliance and a personal relationship, and the couple had a son together, Caesarion. Following Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, and the subsequent power struggle that eventually emerged between Mark Antony and Octavian, who would eventually become the Roman Emperor Augustus, Cleopatra formed a similar political and personal partnership with Antony, and the couple would have 3 children together. It's worth being genuinely careful here about separating documented historical fact from later dramatic embellishment, since much of what shaped popular memory of Cleopatra actually comes from later Roman sources, particularly writers working under the reign of Octavian, who had every political incentive to portray Cleopatra in an unflattering, even villainous light, as a dangerous, manipulative foreign queen who had corrupted a proud Roman general. Since this framing helped Octavian justify his ultimate military campaign against Antony and Cleopatra as a noble defense of Roman values against a genuinely foreign threat, rather than what it more accurately was, a Roman civil war between rival Roman factions. The eventual conflict between Antony and Octavian culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, fought off the western coast of Greece, where Octavian's forces achieved a decisive victory over the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Following this defeat, both Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, and as Octavian's forces approached Alexandria the following year, both ultimately took their own lives rather than face capture and the certain humiliation of being paraded through Rome as conquered prisoners. A fate Cleopatra in particular seems to have been determined to avoid, given the genuine political and personal indignity it would have represented for someone who had ruled as an independent, sovereign monarch. The specific circumstances of Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE have themselves become the subject of considerable historical legend, most famously the widely known account suggesting she died from the bite of an asp, a venomous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. This particular account comes primarily from later Roman historical sources, and while it remains entirely possible, modern historians generally treat it with appropriate caution, noting that ancient historical accounts of famous deaths, particularly regarding politically significant figures, were often shaped as much by dramatic and symbolic storytelling considerations as by strict, verified factual reporting. Some modern researchers have even suggested alternative theories, including the possibility of a self-administered poison, though the truth of exactly what happened in her final hours remains, ultimately, something we cannot know with complete certainty. What we can say with confidence is that Cleopatra's death marked the definitive end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with it, the end of more than 3,000 years of independent Egyptian rule under native or Greek pharaonic authority. Octavian formally annexed Egypt as a Roman province immediately following her death, and Egypt would remain under direct Roman, and later Byzantine, imperial control for the following several centuries, no longer governed by pharaohs, but administered instead as a valuable, agriculturally rich province within a much larger imperial system, centered far away in Rome. There's something genuinely worth pausing on here, a detail we touched on briefly at the very beginning of our journey together tonight, but one that deserves real reflection now that we've traveled through the full arc of Egyptian history to reach this final moment. When Cleopatra looked out from her palace windows in Alexandria, the pyramids of Giza, standing not too terribly far away, were already more than 2,500 years old, already just as much a source of wonder, mystery, and connection to a distant, half-legendary past for her, as they remain for us today. She belonged, in a very real sense, closer to our own historical era than to the era of the pyramid builders who came before her, separated from Khufu by a greater span of time than separates us from the height of the Roman Empire itself. Egyptian civilization, as an independent political and religious tradition centered around pharaonic kingship, effectively ended with Cleopatra. But Egypt itself, and the deep cultural memory of everything this civilization had built and believed across those 3,000 remarkable years, did not simply vanish overnight. Temples continued functioning, in gradually diminishing form, for several more centuries under Roman rule, and elements of traditional Egyptian religious practice persisted, blending gradually with Greek and later Roman religious influences, before eventually giving way entirely to Christianity, which spread widely throughout Egypt in the centuries following Cleopatra's death, and later still to Islam, following the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, which shaped the religious and cultural identity of Egypt into the form most familiar to the modern world today. But what happened to the deep, specific knowledge of ancient Egyptian civilization itself, the language, the religious beliefs, the daily rhythms of life we've spent this entire journey exploring together? How did any of this actually survive? Or rather, how was it eventually rediscovered, after being genuinely lost and forgotten for well over 1,000 years following the decline of traditional Egyptian religious and scribal institutions under Roman and later Christian rule? That's exactly where we're headed now, as we bring this long journey to its quiet, closing chapter. What remained for roughly 14 centuries following the decline of Egypt's traditional temple institutions and scribal traditions under Roman and later Christian rule, the ability to actually read Egyptian hieroglyphic writing was almost entirely lost to the world. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, found at the Temple of Isis at Philae in southern Egypt, dates to 394 CE, and not long afterward, the ancient priestly knowledge required to read this writing system faded away entirely, as traditional Egyptian religious institutions were gradually closed under increasing Christian influence within the later Roman and Byzantine Empire. For the next 1,400 years or so, Egyptian hieroglyphs remained a genuine, profound mystery. Ancient Egypt itself was never entirely forgotten, of course. Its pyramids and monuments remained visible, drawing curious travelers and scholars throughout the medieval and early modern periods, and ancient Greek and Roman writers, including Herodotus, whom we've referenced several times throughout this journey, had left behind their own accounts and observations, though these were often incomplete, and at times, as we've noted, unreliable in various specific details. But the actual specific content of hieroglyphic inscriptions, the names, the religious texts, the administrative records that once filled Egyptian temple walls and papyrus scrolls, remained genuinely unreadable, a beautiful but silent visual language that no living person could actually translate. This changed, dramatically and rather suddenly, following an unexpected discovery in 1799, during Napoleon Bonaparte's military campaign in Egypt. French soldiers, while conducting fortification work near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta, uncovered a large stone slab inscribed with the same text written in 3 separate scripts: hieroglyphic, a simplified Egyptian script known as Demotic, which had developed later in Egyptian history for everyday administrative use, and ancient Greek. Because scholars could already read ancient Greek fluently, this stone, which came to be known as the Rosetta Stone, offered an unprecedented opportunity, a genuine key that might finally unlock the long silent mystery of hieroglyphic writing, provided someone could successfully work out the complex relationship between the 3 parallel texts. This proved to be a genuinely difficult scholarly puzzle, occupying the attention of numerous brilliant researchers across Europe over the following 2 decades. The individual most widely credited with finally achieving the crucial breakthrough was a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion, who had been fascinated by ancient Egypt since childhood, and who possessed an unusually strong background in multiple ancient languages, including Coptic, the latest surviving descendant of the ancient Egyptian language, still used liturgically within the Coptic Christian Church in Egypt, which turned out to hold crucial linguistic clues connecting ancient hieroglyphic vocabulary to a living, still spoken linguistic tradition. In 1822, after years of painstaking, dedicated work, Champollion finally announced that he had successfully deciphered the fundamental principles of hieroglyphic writing, correctly recognizing that it functioned as a genuinely sophisticated combination of phonetic sound-based symbols and symbolic ideas-based symbols, rather than being, as many earlier scholars had mistakenly assumed, a purely symbolic, ideas-based system with no direct phonetic component at all. This breakthrough effectively reopened, after 14 centuries of silence, direct access to the entire vast written record of ancient Egyptian civilization, and it's genuinely difficult to overstate just how significant this moment was for our modern understanding of history. Nearly everything we've discussed throughout this entire journey together tonight, the religious beliefs, the administrative records, the personal letters from Deir el-Medina, the wisdom literature, the funerary texts describing the journey through the afterlife, all of it became newly accessible to modern scholarship because of this single, remarkable scholarly achievement, building on the lucky survival of one particular inscribed stone and the dedicated persistence of researchers determined to understand it. In the 2 centuries since Champollion's breakthrough, archaeological and scholarly understanding of ancient Egypt has continued expanding steadily, sometimes through carefully planned, methodical excavation, and sometimes, as with Howard Carter's discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, through a genuinely remarkable combination of dedicated persistence and simple good fortune. Modern archaeological techniques, including genetic analysis, advanced imaging technology, and increasingly sophisticated environmental and dietary analysis of preserved remains, continue to add new layers of understanding to a civilization that, despite everything we now know, still holds genuine mysteries and open scholarly questions, exactly the kind of quiet, ongoing curiosity that makes returning to this subject, again and again, genuinely worthwhile. As we bring this long journey to its close tonight, let's return, one final time, to the river itself, since it feels like the right place to end where we began. Picture the Nile at dusk, somewhere along its long journey north through the valley, the water catching the last warm colors of a setting sun, deep orange fading slowly into a soft violet blue. Along the riverbank, a farmer is walking home after a long day's work, his sandals quiet against the packed earth path, the fields behind him settling into stillness as the light fades. Somewhere nearby, a woman is calling her children in for the evening meal, the smell of fresh bread and simmering onions drifting from an open doorway. A boat drifts slowly downstream, its sail hanging loose in the still evening air, perhaps carrying grain toward a distant granary, or simply making its way home before full darkness settles over the water. Somewhere in the distance, very faintly, temple bells or the low murmur of an evening ritual might drift across the quiet air. One more ordinary day, among countless thousands of ordinary days, quietly closing across 3,000 years of continuous human life along this single, remarkable river. It's easy, when we talk about ancient Egypt, to focus almost entirely on its most spectacular achievements, the pyramids rising from the desert, the golden mask of a young king, the towering temples of Karnak, the dramatic political intrigue surrounding figures like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramesses, and Cleopatra. And these achievements and these individual lives absolutely deserve our continued fascination and study. But underneath all of it, quietly holding the entire civilization together across 3 full millennia, were countless ordinary people whose names we will likely never know. Farmers who read the height of the flood each year with quiet, practical hope. Mothers who ground grain by hand, hour after hour, to feed their families. Children who played simple games by lamplight after the sun went down. Workers who built extraordinary monuments with their own hands and returned home each evening to ordinary family life, exactly as tired, exactly as hopeful, exactly as human as any working person today. History, in the end, was never simply a sequence of dates and rulers and dramatic events, however genuinely fascinating those events remain. It was made morning after morning of bread baking, water carried from the river, children calling to each other in the street, prayers whispered quietly for protection and blessing, and families gathering together as the light faded each evening, hoping, as families have always hoped, for a peaceful night and another good day to follow it. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through ancient Egypt tonight, you're welcome to subscribe and join us for the next one, whenever you're ready for another peaceful night with us. I'd genuinely love to know in the comments where you listened from tonight, what your local time was as you drifted through this story, and what part of ancient Egypt's long history you found most interesting, whether it was the pyramids, the pharaohs, the gods, or simply the quiet, ordinary daily rhythms of a family living somewhere along the riverbank, 3,000 years ago. And if you're still awake, there's another quiet journey through history waiting for you, whenever you're ready to begin it. For now, though, let the fire settle. Let your thoughts drift, slow and unhurried, the way that river has drifted quietly north for longer than any of us can properly imagine. Somewhere in the deep and settled dark, that same river is still moving quietly through the valley, patient as it has always been, carrying, as it always has, everything that came before it gently into rest. Good night.